She signed the paper, trading her freedom for exactly 6 months, believing she was stepping into a prison of ice, completely unaware that there she would find the only warmth capable of saving her life. Can you imagine the sheer desperation of a woman who agrees to marry the most feared and cold-hearted man in the entire region, solely to pay off her family's crushing debts, knowing full well that there won't be a single drop of affection in this commercial arrangement? But this tale of courage, deep secrets, and profound transformation took place in the month of May 1924, across the wide-open, frost-bitten plains of Montana in the heart of the American West. Before we uncover the destiny and the mysteries of this unexpected union, tell me right here in the comments which city and state you are tuning in from to watch our channel. I read every single comment, and I absolutely love knowing how far our stories are reaching. So leave your city down below, and I will be sure to leave a little heart for you. Now, get yourself comfortable, brew a fresh pot of coffee or steep some hot tea, and come with me to dive into this thrilling and emotional narrative. The howling Montana wind whistled through the cracks of the wooden windows at the old Vance homestead, bringing with it the damp scent of frozen earth and the grim promise of a bitter night. Isabel pulled her dark wool shawl tighter around her narrow shoulders, feeling the piercing cold seep not only into her bones, but into the very depths of her soul. At 28 years old, she carried in her brown eyes, usually so full of vibrant life, the crushing weight of a ruined legacy. On the rustic dining table, illuminated only by the flickering yellowish light of a kerosene lantern, lay the final collection notices from the central bank. The numbers, drafted in thick black ink, looked like death sentences ready to be executed. Her father had passed away a little over a year ago, the victim of a tired heart, leaving behind a trail of debts incurred from failed wheat harvests and raw deals made with dishonest ranchers who had taken cruel advantage of his good faith. The absolute final deadline for payment, or the total forfeiture of the lands that had belonged to her family for 3 generations, would expire in exactly 7 days. Isabel ran her freezing fingertips over the rough paper of the county clerk's latest notification, feeling a painful knot tighten in her throat, making it incredibly hard to breathe. She had tried absolutely everything in her power to reverse that imminent tragedy. She had sold off the last 20 head of scrawny cattle, dismissed the loyal ranch hands with tears streaming down her face, and worked from sunup to sundown in the vegetable garden with her bare hands, trying to scrape together some cash by selling produce at the town market on Sunday mornings. But the meager coins she managed to gather were laughable amounts compared to the mountain of interest the ruthless bankers were piling up without a shred of pity. The house now smelled of old floor wax, accumulated dust, and a silent, heavy despair, a constant, suffocating reminder of the forced abandonment that was fast approaching. It was at that precise moment of solitary anguish, while listening to the melancholy hoot of an owl in the distance and the crackle of dying firewood in the cast-iron stove, that loud, heavy and rhythmic knocks echoed on the front door. The sudden sound startled Isabel so violently that the flame of the lantern trembled wildly inside its glass chimney. No one ever visited the ruined Vance property anymore, much less at night, under near-zero temperatures that were already freezing the dew on the pastures. She walked with cautious steps down the narrow, dark hallway, listening to the melancholy creak of the old floorboards beneath her worn leather boots. Upon opening the heavy oak door, the freezing wind invaded the foyer without asking permission, bringing with it the imposing figure of a tall man with impressively broad shoulders. He was dressed in a thick sheepskin duster and a wide-brimmed Stetson hat that cast a dark shadow over part of his rugged features. Isabel instinctively took a step back, her heart beating erratically in her chest as she immediately recognized his commanding posture. It was Vincent Alistair, the sole owner of the Frontier Ranch, the largest, wealthiest, and most prosperous quarter-horse and beef cattle operation in the entire state. Vincent was widely known across the cobblestone streets of the local town for two very distinct things: his incalculable fortune that seemed to have no end, and his heart, which appeared to have been forged from the purest, most unforgiving ice. It was whispered in the town's social circles that he never smiled, never participated in local festivities, entirely avoided the barn dances, and managed his vast empire with a calculating coldness that frightened even the oldest and bravest men in the valley. Vincent slowly and politely removed his hat, revealing perfectly slicked-back dark hair and brown eyes so incredibly deep they looked like black pools in the dim light of the hallway. His face was marked by a tense jawline, a shadow of 5 o'clock stubble, and an expression that was absolutely unreadable. He asked for permission to step inside, stating in a deep, controlled voice that resonated through the drafty space that the night was far too bitter for conversations on a dilapidated porch. Isabel, torn between extreme surprise and natural distrust, stepped aside to let him pass, catching the striking scent of genuine leather, expensive tobacco, and damp prairie grass that emanated from his heavy clothes as he brushed so closely by. She guided him in silence to the decaying living room, offering him a woven cane chair near the unlit fireplace, but he shook his head and preferred to remain standing, utterly dominating the space. Without any sort of beating around the bush or empty pleasantries, Vincent looked directly into her frightened eyes and declared that he knew in rich and meticulous detail the desperate financial situation the Vance family was facing with the bank. He mentioned the 7-day deadline and the exact amount of the debt with a surgical precision that made Isabel's stomach churn in a sickening mixture of shame and panic. The young woman raised her chin, gathering every fragment of shattered dignity she had left in that desolate scenario. She asked him, her voice surprisingly steady despite the uncontrollable trembling in her hands, if he had ridden for hours in the pitch black of night just to have the twisted pleasure of witnessing someone else's absolute ruin up close. Vincent did not show the slightest hint of irritation at her palpable hostility. On the contrary, his dark eyes seemed to evaluate the fierce courage of the woman standing before him, much like a master craftsman analyzing the strength of a fine piece of timber. He took a deep breath, the sound filling the heavy silence of the cold room, and replied in a low tone that he was not there to mock her late father's memory, but rather to propose a strict commercial business deal that would permanently save the property from total ruin. Isabel frowned, completely bewildered, and demanded to know what kind of business a man so incredibly powerful, who already possessed everything the world could offer, could possibly want with a woman who owned nothing but unpayable debts and a crumbling farmhouse. It was then that Vincent pulled a document, folded into crisp thirds, from the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and placed it squarely on the wooden table right next to the bank's foreclosure notices. He explained with the monotonous, detached tone of an accountant reading a routine financial report that he urgently needed a wife. Isabel's eyes went wide, the sheer shock stealing the words right out of her mouth. But before she could voice her fierce indignation or throw him out of her house, Vincent raised a large, calloused hand, firmly requesting that she listen until the very end before taking any passionate or rash actions. He recounted, without displaying a single ounce of emotion, that his late grandfather, a profoundly traditional, controlling man, deeply attached to social appearances, had left an absurd and utterly inflexible clause in his primary will. In order for Vincent to assume total, legal and definitive control of the family's lucrative beef export routes and railroad contracts, he needed to be legally married on paper and maintain this flawless union in the eyes of high society for at least 6 months prior to his 35th birthday, a date that was dangerously approaching on the calendar. Otherwise, the entirety of the administration and the family assets would automatically pass into the reckless hands of a distant cousin from the East Coast, an irresponsible man addicted to high-stakes gambling, who would undoubtedly destroy 3 generations of hard work in a matter of months. Vincent stated, looking fixedly and intensely at Isabel, that he had absolutely zero interest in love, in sugary romances, or in building a real, traditional family. He needed, uniquely and exclusively, a legal contract, a rigorous ironclad agreement of 6 months, nothing more and certainly nothing less. His freezing words hung heavily in the icy air of the living room, mixing with the sharp scent of burnt kerosene. Vincent continued his relentless explanation, detailing the terms of the arrangement with the precision of a ruthless lawyer. He would pay all of the Vance family's debts in cold, hard cash the very day following the civil wedding, clearing her late father's name for good. Isabel would move immediately to the Frontier Ranch, where she would have her own private master suite in the East Wing, total independence, lavish meals, and every comfort that immense wealth could buy. They would appear together at the town church on Sunday mornings, attend a select few strategic business dinners with important investors, and pretend to be a highly respectable and harmonious couple for the curious eyes of local society. Inside the house, however, they would lead completely separate lives. No marital obligations, no unwanted touches, no intimate or probing questions, and above all else, no feelings involved. At the end of exactly 6 months and 1 day, they would quietly annul the marriage in the courts, citing irreconcilable differences. He would secure the gigantic inheritance guaranteed by the law, and she would keep her ancestral lands completely free of debt, receiving an additional, highly generous trust fund in cash to fully renovate the old house and start her life over with her head held high. It was a pure, simple, and coldly calculated business transaction. Isabel looked down at the official document resting on the table, and then brought her gaze back up to Vincent's sculpted, impenetrable face. The proposal sounded like a violent insult to her deepest moral principles, a petty, soulless bargain that reduced the sacred institution of holy matrimony to a mere commercial transaction of buying and selling. She felt her blood boil with righteous indignation, the heat rushing intensely to her pale cheeks, and she replied in a raised, angry voice that she was not an item for sale on a general store shelf. She told him in no uncertain terms that she would far rather lose the ranch, move to the city to scrub floors on her hands and knees, wash strangers' laundry, or starve in the freezing streets, than hand over her dignity to an arrogant, empty shell of a man who believed his money could buy even the honor and destiny of human beings. Vincent did not blink. He did not retreat a single inch. He simply took a slow, deliberate step forward, moving close enough that the massive shadow of his stature completely covered Isabel, and she could actually feel the subtle, radiating heat emanating from his large body. With a dangerously calm voice, almost a harsh whisper that sharply contrasted with the furious, howling wind outside, he asked her if her highly sacred honor would be capable of sheltering her from the freezing winter rain when the county sheriff physically threw her off the property that very week. He argued that blind pride was an excruciatingly expensive luxury that people standing on the very edge of the abyss simply could not afford, and that she was a far too intelligent woman to desperately cling to romantic illusions from storybooks while her father's legacy of blood, sweat, and tears crumbled into dust beneath her feet. The surgical mention of her father was like a precise knife to Isabel's chest. The silence reigned once more, far denser and heavier than before. She squeezed her eyes shut tightly, remembering the calloused, cracked hands of old man Vance, the endless sweat he had poured into that dry Montana dirt that was now about to be seized by suited bankers who had never planted a single seed in their miserable lives. She swallowed hard. the bitter, metallic taste of defeat and harsh reality mixing with the undeniable truth of Vincent's harsh words. When she finally opened her eyes again, the burning fire of youthful indignation had been entirely replaced by the cutting, chilling ice of survival. She straightened her posture, looked dead at the legal document, and asked him, her voice thick with emotion but resolute, if he would guarantee in writing with his own signature that after the agreed 6 months were up, he would leave her in peace forever with absolutely no retaliation. Vincent nodded with a slight, dry and decisive movement of his head, confirming that he would honor every single comma, every period of that contract, ensuring the agreement would be as professional and brutally cold as the very night that surrounded them. Without uttering another word, deeply terrified she might lose her fleeting courage, Isabel took the heavy silver fountain pen that Vincent extended toward her. The metal was surprisingly and incredibly warm from the contact with his large hand, a minuscule, intimate detail that made her shiver violently on the inside. With quick, sharp movements, she signed her name on the dotted line, sealing her ultimate fate. 3 torturous days later, the wedding took place in the small, dusty and poorly lit county clerk's office in the center of town, before a profoundly bored justice of the peace who kept impatiently checking his pocket watch, and 2 female clerks who had been paid off to sign the registry as witnesses. There were no white roses, there was no lace gown, there was no emotional organ music, and there were most definitely no passionate, loving smiles. Isabel wore a simple, deeply modest navy blue wool dress, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, tight style, while Vincent wore an impeccably tailored dark suit, looking much more like a man attending a somber business funeral than his own wedding ceremony. When the judge brought down the heavy stamp and legally declared them husband and wife before the laws of men, they did not even brush against each other. There was no kiss to seal the union. Vincent simply took the freshly folded marriage certificate, tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket with a completely mechanical gesture, turned to Isabel, and dryly informed her that the private carriage was already waiting on the street. The exhausting, bone-rattling journey to the frontier ranch lasted almost 3 full hours over the uneven, rutted dirt roads. The silence inside the velvet-lined cabin was so incredibly oppressive and dense that Isabel felt she could hear the jagged sound of her own rapid breathing. She spent the entire trip staring blankly out the small glass window, watching the vast, rolling green plains turn into dark blurs. The endless stretches of barbed wire fences that seemed to go on forever, feeling the colossal, crushing weight of the decision she had just made pressing down on her chest. When they finally arrived at the massive property as the sun was just beginning to hide below the rugged horizon, the ostentatious grandeur of the place literally took Isabel's breath away. The main manor was a pharaonic, imposing architectural marvel dating back to the late 19th century. It boasted immaculate white walls, extensive wraparound porches that circled the entire structure, supported by thick, intricately carved hardwood columns and massive, crystalline glass windows that perfectly reflected the melancholy, deep orange light of the prairie sunset. The vast front courtyard was flawlessly paved with irregular river stones, and purebred horses whinnied in the immaculate sprawling stables located in the distance. The comforting smell of oak wood burning in the tall stone chimneys and of the damp earth moistened by the evening dew dominated the atmosphere, bringing an undeniable air of extreme wealth. When the luxurious carriage finally rolled to a stop, Vincent stepped down first with surprising agility and, to Isabel's total and utter shock, extended a gloved hand to help her navigate the small metal steps. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before accepting it. The touch of her feminine fingers through his thick leather gloves was rapid, incredibly firm, and entirely impersonal, but in some bizarre and inexplicable way, it sent a sudden, unexpected electric shiver racing straight down her spine. As soon as Isabel's laced boots safely touched the stone ground, he retracted his hand abruptly, instantly returning to his perpetually rigid, distant, and completely unattainable posture. At the enormous double front doors, beautifully carved, with antique family crests, an older woman with an incredibly straight posture, fully grey hair tied back in a severe bun, and wearing an impeccably white, starched apron over a dark dress, stood waiting for them. Vincent introduced her with very few words as Mrs. Higgins, the deeply trusted housekeeper who had meticulously managed the organization of that immense household for over 25 years. Mrs. Higgins offered a highly respectful curtsy, bowing her head slightly, but her remarkably wise and perceptive eyes thoroughly analyzed Isabel from head to toe in a mere fraction of a second. The veteran housekeeper seemed to be actively searching between the lines for some trace of genuine affection, a contained, secret smile, a bright spark in the eyes between the newlyweds, finding absolutely zero signs of life there. Vincent completely ignored the employee's evaluative gaze and issued rapid, highly direct orders, requesting that she immediately show Isabel to the primary guest bedroom in the East Wing. He justified this dryly, without even glancing in his new wife's direction, stating that she would need plenty of space to organize her belongings and rest, and that he would be locked in his study working until late into the night, resolving urgent matters with the foreman. The incredibly flimsy excuse for sleeping in entirely separate bedrooms on their wedding night did not seem to convince Mrs. Higgins for a single second. But the older woman, highly trained in the delicate art of absolute discretion, asked no probing questions. She simply picked up Isabel's small, heavily worn leather suitcase with care and asked, in a velvety, soothing voice, that the young madam follow her upstairs. The interior of the great house was even more intimidating and majestic than its grand exterior facade. The wide corridors boasted towering ceilings featuring hand-painted details, heavy cast-iron chandeliers dripping with crystal pendants, rich imported tapestries, and thick Persian rugs that completely muffled the sound of their footsteps, alongside perfectly polished, dark, solid wood antique furniture. There was an undeniable, ostentatious material wealth overflowing in every corner, but there was also an incredibly oppressive emptiness, a deep coldness that clearly did not stem from the freezing weather outside. It lacked warm colors, it lacked vibrant life circulating. It completely lacked the cozy chaos, the spontaneous laughter, and the scattered, happy memories that transform a beautiful, expensive building into a true, breathing home. It was, in stark reality, a perfectly organized museum, entirely dedicated to profound loneliness. The spacious bedroom assigned to Isabel was located at the silent, dead end of a long hallway decorated with framed landscape paintings. It was an absurdly large room, containing a massive canopy bed dressed with pure linen sheets, heavy, bottle-green velvet curtains, and an enormous stone fireplace that was already crackling strongly, effectively chasing away the intense chill of the environment. Mrs. Higgins placed the humble suitcase onto a carved cedar chest sitting at the foot of the bed and informed her in a carefully neutral tone that the official dinner would be served in the main dining room at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, subtly warning her that the master was a highly methodical man who absolutely did not tolerate tardiness under any circumstances. Isabel thanked her for the clear instruction with a contained, deeply tired smile. When the thick wooden door finally clicked shut, leaving her completely alone, she walked slowly over to the edge of the sumptuous bed, sat down heavily, and felt the entire crushing weight of that monumental isolation crash down upon her fragile shoulders like a violent avalanche of snow. The very first dinner forcefully set the melancholic and incredibly tense tone for all the long weeks that followed. The solid mahogany table in the immense dining room was long enough to comfortably seat a banquet for 20 people, but only 2 places had been set with extreme rigid precision, one at each diametrically opposed end of the long wooden surface. The glaring physical distance between them seemed to perfectly mirror the invisible, entirely insurmountable barrier firmly established in the signed contract. The food prepared by the highly skilled cook was abundant, carrying mouth-watering aromas, perfectly seasoned and absolutely delicious. There was a steaming pot roast falling apart at the fork, a rich and spiced wild rice skillet, freshly baked molasses beans, and thick slices of candied squash that gleamed beautifully in the candlelight. However, for Isabel, all that magnificent flavor was completely lost in the suffocating heavy silence that swallowed the massive room whole. The only existing sound in the entire environment was the sharp, high-pitched clinking of the heavy, genuine silver cutlery rhythmically striking the fine imported porcelain plates, and the sporadic, comforting crackle of the wood burning in the monumental stone fireplace in the background. Vincent ate his generous portions with elegant, precise movements, his dark, intense gaze fixed and deeply focused on some undefined point on the wall adorned with oil paintings, acting exactly as if he were completely oblivious to her mere existence in the room. Isabel, in turn, being far too proud to attempt bringing up trivial, useless conversation only to be coldly rejected with monosyllabic answers, chewed her food painfully slowly. She spent the long, dragging minutes focusing her attention entirely and obsessively on the minute floral details of the richly embroidered tablecloth, simply to aggressively avoid crossing gazes with her fake husband at all costs. The daily routine on the vast frontier ranch was soon established with the mechanical, flawless precision of a well-oiled pocket watch. The deep isolation of both individuals had strictly scheduled hours. Vincent woke up punctually, before the dawn even thought about tearing through the dark sky, drank his strong, bitter cowboy coffee on the covered porch, thick with morning fog, staring out at the white frost covering the plains, and rode out on horseback to tirelessly inspect the hundreds of heads of cattle and the hard work of the ranch hands across the sprawling property. Isabel, having absolutely no chores or obligations in a house efficiently managed by dozens of employees, woke up later, spending her long, deeply solitary mornings walking aimlessly through the vast, meticulously pruned winter gardens, or losing track of the hours reading classic literature in the house's gigantic library, a glorious refuge that smelled heavily of aged paper, leather bindings, and beeswax. The two of them only bumped into each other physically during the main meal times, moments when they maintained strictly formal, incredibly stiff dialogues about completely irrelevant trivialities, such as the abrupt changes in the mountain weather, the formal legal notices left by the county clerk, or the strict requirements of their imminent, unavoidable social commitments. When they were absolutely obligated to go into town on Sunday mornings, Vincent played his theatrical role to absolute perfection. He gently helped her step up into the polished buggy, offered his strong, firm arm for them to walk up the steps of the main church, and smoothly answered the effusive greetings of neighboring ranchers with an elegant yet unquestionably icy politeness. To all of the region's high and incredibly gossipy society, they were viewed as a perfectly reserved, highly traditional, respectable, and aristocratic couple. But in the harsh, undeniable reality of the facts, for Isabel, they were merely 2 stranded strangers inhabiting the exact opposite ends of the same freezing, deserted island. However, as the monotonous days slowly turned into cold, bitter weeks, Isabel, utilizing her highly observant nature, began to notice small, subtle, and entirely involuntary details that slowly began to crack the supposedly impenetrable image of a feelingless Iceman that Vincent projected with such tremendous effort. On a particularly freezing Tuesday, late in the afternoon, while she was walking completely unnoticed near the large storage barns holding wool and grain, she heard her husband's unmistakable deep voice coming from behind a wooden structure. Hiding silently behind a massive stack of sweet-smelling hay bales, Isabel stopped dead in her tracks and watched. Vincent was speaking in a very low tone with one of the oldest and most humble ranch hands on the property. The hard-working man, nervously clutching his tattered straw hat tightly against his chest with dirt-stained hands, was explaining with a trembling, choked voice that his wife, an elderly woman in her twilight years, had been burning up with a dangerously high fever for 2 whole days. He said, with his eyes welling up with deep shame, that she desperately needed very expensive medicines from the town apothecary, rich vitamins, and a good doctor that his humble salary could never, ever afford, practically begging for an advance on his future wages. Isabel, all too accustomed to the cruel tyranny of the wealthy ranchers in that region, held her breath in suspense. She honestly expected Vincent to calculate the loan's interest rate in a cruel manner, or simply deny the desperate plea, harshly, coldly claiming that the personal problems of the employees were of no concern to the business. Instead, his reaction left her entirely paralyzed in shock. Without uttering a single word of reprimand or hesitation, Vincent took a large step forward and placed his large, firm hand directly onto the worker's hunched shoulder in a gesture of undeniable, silent support. Next, he reached deep into the pocket of his rustic wool coat, pulled out a considerably thick wad of cash in large bills, an amount vastly superior to any fair or standard salary advance, and pressed it firmly into the man's calloused, shaking hands. Vincent then ordered, with a fierce strictness that absolutely permitted no refusal, that the ranch hand stop working that very second, go straight to the stables, saddle the absolute best, fastest horse on the ranch, and ride like hell to town to buy every single thing the doctor prescribed, along with the very best, most nourishing food he could find. He sternly warned the man, using a purposefully harsh and highly authoritarian tone, that if he found out the man dared to return to hard labor and left his elderly, sick wife alone in bed, he would fire him for just cause right then and there. Vincent's tone of voice was deliberately gruff, demanding and controlling, but the action itself overflowed with a gigantic, silent, and instinctively protective generosity of a man who cared deeply and profoundly for the people under his responsibility, yet absolutely despised letting anyone see his hidden kindness. Isabel practically ran back into the massive house, carefully dodging the busy ranch hands, with her heart beating erratically against her ribs and her palms sweating profusely inside her warm gloves. That very small, incredibly fast, and tremendously powerful glimpse of deep, hidden humanity utterly scrambled all the absolute certainties and harsh prejudices she had accumulated regarding the cruel terms of the contract they had signed. On that very same restless night, the unforgiving winter of the high plains decided to show its darkest, most tempestuous and cruel face. A violent storm of howling winds and torrential freezing rain suddenly crashed down upon the ranch's pastures, accompanied by a deafening, shrieking whistle that made the glass of the tall windows vibrate intensely, making it feel as if they were going to shatter into 1,000 deadly pieces on the hardwood floor at any given moment. A blinding white bolt of lightning violently tore through the absolute darkness of the night sky, illuminating everything for a terrifying split second, immediately followed by a monstrous, deafening crash of thunder that violently shook even the deep stone foundations of the century-old manor. Immediately following the terrifying boom, every single electric light in the massive house flickered wildly and died completely, plunging the enormous environment into a thick, dense, and deeply claustrophobic darkness. Isabel, who had been deeply engrossed in reading a novel in the isolated library, shrank back profoundly into the large, dark leather armchair. She felt an uncontrollable, violent shiver of irrational fear mix with the biting cold that was beginning to invade the room, because the specific fireplace in that room had not been lit that evening by the staff, leaving the place with a freezing, tomb-like atmosphere. Completely disoriented in the pitch-black void, she carefully tried to feel her uncertain way around, desperately searching for the brass doorknob to escape the room, when a trembling, yellowish beam from a gas lantern suddenly cut right through the macabre shadows of the main hallway. Long, firm, and hurried footsteps approached, thudding heavily against the floorboards. It was Vincent, drastically different from his usual impeccable, suited posture of a wealthy cattle baron. He was completely without his formal wool jacket, wearing only his riding trousers and a crisp white shirt, with the sleeves clumsily rolled up to his strong forearms and the top buttons of the collar undone, revealing the slightly bronzed skin of his thick neck. His dark hair, always meticulously slicked back with pomade, was slightly messy, with a few dark strands falling stubbornly over his forehead. He stopped abruptly in the heavy wooden frame of the library door, lifting the gas lantern high into the air with his strong arm, brightly illuminating Isabel's pale, terrified face. The broad, deep breathing of his massive chest was noticeably accelerated. Vincent asked, shattering the tense silence with a deep tone of voice that, no matter how hard he tried to disguise it, completely failed to hide a clear, vibrating edge of genuine, raw concern. He asked if she was in one piece and if she had hurt herself in the fright. Isabel simply nodded very slowly, her large eyes wide open, hugging her own arms tightly against her chest in a desperate and completely useless attempt to ward off the freezing chill and her nervousness, replying with a choked, shaky voice that the sudden storm had caught her off guard, but that she was completely unharmed. Vincent slowly lowered the bright lantern upon noticing the continuous rhythmic trembling in her tense, small shoulders. The heavy silence reigned once more, broken only by the aggressive, deafening sound of the rain violently lashing against the roof above them. Without saying a single word of warning, without asking for any prior permission, he walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the leather armchair where she was standing. He carefully placed the hissing lantern onto the small mahogany side table and then removed from his own broad shoulder a thick, incredibly heavy blanket of raw wool he had brought with him. With movements that were incredibly slow, surprisingly gentle, and perfectly controlled for a man widely known for his rough and abrasive nature, he unfolded the large piece of warm fabric and placed it over Isabel's petite shoulders, wrapping her and covering her with a profound care that bordered on silent, holy devotion. During the intimate gesture of covering her, the tips of the fingers of his large hands calloused from wrangling cattle and handling coarse leather reins, ended up brushing lightly and entirely accidentally against the woman's freezing, pale cheeks. The abrupt, startling contrast of his hot, alive, and distinctly masculine skin against the icy surface of Isabel's frightened face caused an invisible electric shock, a brilliant spark of pure tension that made both of them completely hold their breath for a long, incredibly dangerous fraction of a second. Unlike what he had done on their very first day together, Vincent did not retract his hand immediately as if he had just touched burning fire. He completely froze in place. He stood tall before her, his imposing body leaning incredibly close, so terribly, dangerously close that she could intoxicatingly smell the striking, comforting scent of pine wood, lye soap, fine tobacco, and that intense, wild rain that was violently washing the world outside. Vincent's dark, unfathomable eyes, partially illuminated by the golden glow of the lantern's fire, travelled slowly downwards from Isabel's shining, frightened eyes to her lips, which were reddened from the biting cold. He hesitated. It was a rare moment of absolute weakness, a highly dangerous instant where the heavy iron armors threatened to crash down to the floor. The dense, thick silence in the library, completely isolated from the screaming fury of the wind outside, suddenly felt heavily charged with silent confessions, unspoken words, and an overwhelming magnetic tension that absolutely no legal contract in the world, no matter how astutely drafted by brilliant lawyers, could ever prevent from existing. Isabel felt a sweeping wave of overwhelming heat rush up from her stomach straight to her chest, completely and instantaneously forgetting her irrational fear of the dark or the deafening thunder. Hypnotized by the sheer intensity of that close, burning gaze, she almost in an insane and entirely irrational way deeply wished he would just lean in, close that single, agonizing inch of distance that separated them, and kiss her once and for all. But as if fate absolutely loved to play cruel jokes with the desires of the human heart, the immense, ancient grandfather clock positioned in the main hallway struck the full hour with a deep funereal sound of heavy bronze bells, violently shattering the invisible spell that had completely enveloped them. The loud metallic crash made Vincent blink his eyes frantically. He abruptly straightened his posture, forcefully retracting his arms as if he had just been severely burned on hot coals, and took two very large, quick steps backward, swallowing hard. In the blink of an eye, the massive emotional wall shot right back up. He hastily retreated deep inside his familiar, impenetrable armor of calculated coldness. He cleared his throat loudly, averted his gaze sharply toward the dusty books on the shelves so he wouldn't have to look her in the eye, and said, with a tight and excessively hoarse voice, that he would leave the lantern right there with her so she could safely find her way back to her bedroom. He then recommended, in a dry, highly abrasive tone, that she lock her bedroom windows tightly to prevent the driving rain from ruining the expensive rugs. Before Isabel could even formulate a single word or thank him for the deeply caring gesture with the blanket, he quickly spun on his heels and completely disappeared into the shadows of the dark hallway like a ghost fleeing the morning light. He left her entirely, absolutely alone, accompanied only by the flickering golden light of the gas lantern and the soft, highly persistent warmth of the thick wool draped over her tense shoulders. The heavy blanket strongly exuded his natural masculine scent. On that long, tempestuous night, Isabel simply could not manage to close her eyes for a single second. She tossed and turned from one side to the other beneath the heavy covers in her incredibly spacious bed, her chest rising and falling at an accelerated pace. She realized right then, with a terrifying yet delicious clarity, that the supposed commercial agreement she had signed in blood, designed exclusively to be strict, rational, and completely devoid of emotion, was actively beginning to play with her fragile, guarded heart in an irreversible and highly dangerous manner. She repeated to herself several times in the total darkness, whispering it like a protective mantra, to ward off the imminent madness, that there were only a little over 5 months left before she would leave that massive place forever, that he was a terrifying man of ice who felt absolutely nothing for her, and that all of this was nothing more than a gigantic fake theater of social appearances. However, her physical body was completely incapable of lying to her logical mind. The vivid, almost tactile memory of the warm, hesitant touch of Vincent's rough fingers on her face told a story exactly the opposite of reason. That tiny, fleeting touch had completely warmed the cold, deeply solitary core of her existence in a way she had never ever dared to predict when she signed that fateful paper. The following morning, The pale, timid winter sun of the west struggled with immense difficulty to break through the thick curtain of heavy grey clouds, reflecting its weak golden rays into the dozens of dark mud puddles that heavily splattered the immense paved courtyard of the ranch. The dawn air still smelled strongly of soaked earth, trampled prairie grass, and carried the undeniable electric charge left behind by the fury of the nighttime storm. Isabel dragged herself out of bed after a completely sleepless night and walked down the monumental wooden staircase toward the dining room, heading for breakfast. Her heart was beating erratically beneath the light fabric of her dress, and a potent mixture of fierce anxiety and youthful expectation throbbed violently in her veins. She had spent the entire morning secretly wondering how Vincent would look at her after the electric, unspoken, and incredibly dangerous proximity they had shared the night before. Would their eyes finally meet? Would he avert his gaze in deep shame? However, upon stepping into the vast room, a wave of crushing disappointment hit her hard. The grand dining room was completely empty and dead silent. On the far end of the dark mahogany table, only a delicate porcelain cup containing the dregs of black, completely cold coffee and an entirely untouched plate of biscuits marked the incredibly hasty passage of the man earlier that morning. Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, who was entering the room at that exact moment holding a steaming silver pitcher of fresh milk milked in the early hours of the day, immediately noticed the subtle, crushing disappointment that made her mistress's shoulders slump heavily. Breaking her habitual, incredibly strict silence of service, she cleared her throat lightly and informed Isabel, while pouring milk into her cup, that Master Vincent had left the house while it was still pitch black outside, long before the roosters even thought about crowing, taking 3 heavily armed foremen with him. The housekeeper hesitated for a brief moment, nervously looking side to side, as if she terrified the very stone walls of the house might be listening, and then added, with a deeply mysterious, low tone of voice heavily laden with grave concern, that a long, incredibly sturdy stretch of the barbed wire fences on the southern border of the ranch had been mysteriously cleanly cut from end to end during the absolute peak of the violent storm, and more than 30 head of elite, incredibly expensive prize cattle brought in from out of state had vanished into the thin air of the darkness. Isabel frowned instantly, her stomach tightening painfully as she sat down heavily at the table and served herself a generous piece of homemade cornbread that suddenly didn't look very appetizing at all. She asked naively, desperately trying to find a logical, peaceful explanation, if perhaps the cattle had simply been spooked by the infernal, deafening noise of the thunder and had violently burst through the fence in a desperate, blind attempt to escape the storm. Mrs. Higgins stopped pouring the hot milk, straightened her spine, and shook her head negatively from side to side. The severe, wrinkled expression on the older woman's face took on sharp contours of genuine, deep alarm. The housekeeper explained, leaning slightly over the table and lowering her voice even further into a whisper, that thick wires of braided steel and heavy barbed wire simply do not snap on their own in a symmetrical, perfectly clean manner, and that thick, deeply anchored fence posts made of solid ironwood are not violently ripped from the ground and knocked over merely by the force of wind, no matter how hurricane-like it might be. Someone, acting stealthily under the perfect cover of the torrential rain that washed away all tracks in the mud, had intentionally cut the fence with heavy-duty tools and aggressively driven the animals away. Isabel felt a terrible, icy shiver race straight up the base of her spine, instantaneously comprehending the dark magnitude and immense gravity of the situation. The imposing frontier ranch, the unshakable, invincible fortress of the region, was not merely suffering the normal, expected losses of an accident caused by the sheer force of nature. The vast ranch was clearly and undeniably under direct attack by human enemies, The mental, deeply disturbing image of Vincent, the very man she had seen looking so incredibly vulnerable the night before, now riding tensely across the vast, rain-soaked plains, facing the cutting, freezing cold and the highly imminent deadly danger of armed men to deal with cowardly saboteurs, squeezed something incredibly deep and primal inside Isabel's chest. The long-dormant instinct for protection and zealous care, a fierce, courageous feeling that she sincerely believed she had buried deep in the dirt, alongside the cursed debts of her late father and the bitter disappointments of her past, suddenly began to awaken with a surprising, wild, and entirely unexpected force inside her. She acutely realized that she simply could not sit there peacefully drinking tea while that man's entire livelihood and safety were at severe risk. Suddenly driven by an irrational burning urgency, an uncontrollable desire to deeply understand exactly what the hell was actively threatening the peace and safety of the place she now lived and the very man with whom she shared her last name, Isabel made an incredibly bold, reckless decision. She left her coffee half-finished, violently pushed the heavy wooden chair back, completely ignored the shocked, wide-eyed features of the housekeeper, and ran quickly upstairs to her bedroom. She pulled on heavy leather riding boots built for deep mud and threw on a thick wool coat. She walked with rapid, firm, and fiercely determined steps across the floorboards of the manor until she reached the west wing of the ground floor. A dead, silent hallway where her husband's absolutely untouchable sanctuary was located, Vincent's private business office. That was the one and only part, the single square meter of the entire gigantic house that was strictly, vehemently forbidden to her by unspoken, ironclad rules, the sacred, completely inviolable stronghold of the man of ice. The highly polished hardwood floor creaked loudly under her nervous feet as she reached out a trembling hand and tested, with the tips of her fingers, the large, heavy brass doorknob of the carved double doors. To her absolute, utter surprise, and quite possibly facilitated by the absurd, stressful rush of Vincent's highly impulsive departure during that chaotic, rainy dawn, the brass knob actually turned. The heavy door had not been locked with a key, as it usually was. It yielded under Isabel's weight with a soft, muffled metallic click, revealing to her wide, curious eyes a room of very generous proportions, but deeply shrouded in a serious, heavy penumbra. The environment was almost oppressively dominated by the dense, strong, and highly characteristic scent of expensive Cuban cigar smoke, natural leather polishing wax, aged paper, and a subtle, lingering note of oak-aged whiskey. The office was, without a single shadow of a doubt, a faithful, highly tangible extension of Vincent Alistair's methodical, entirely cold, and extremely organized mind. Along the four walls of the room, tall bookcases crafted from expensive rosewood stretched directly from the hardwood floor all the way to the intricately carved ceiling. They were completely, densely packed with massive hardcover accounting ledgers, lined up in a millimeter-perfect military fashion without a single folio resting out of place. In the exact center of the majestic room, resting upon an immense dark red oriental rug, sat a massive, heavy mahogany desk. The surface of this grand desk was almost entirely covered with large, rolled-up topographical and hydrographical maps of the border region, dozens of official legal documents sporting the colorful wax seals of the county clerk, and tall stacks of financial newspapers printed in the capital, displaying the daily market prices for grain sacks and beef weights. Isabel walked very, very slowly toward the center of the silent room, completely holding her breath. With every single step she took upon the soft rug that entirely muffled her movements, she felt exactly like a profane, dirty invader, as if she were physically trespassing into the very depths of the mysterious, deeply bruised soul of her marriage of convenience husband, a soul locked away under lock and key. Her anxious eyes roamed over the rigorous, pristine order of the objects: the heavy crystal inkwell, the razor-sharp silver letter opener, the half-opened cedar cigar box. The young woman's perceptive gaze, however, was inevitably magnetically drawn to the right side and corner of the massive desk. There, one of the heavy wooden drawers was left slightly noticeably ajar. Apparently, in the blind rush to grab some highly important document or a loaded revolver during the chaotic, dark, early hours of the morning, it had been closed in extreme haste. Through the small gap, the worn edge of an old brown leather folder was clearly revealed, heavily scuffed and torn at the seams, with a chaotic, desperate amount of yellowed papers spilling out. That highly specific, messy disorder violently contrasted with the obsessive, perfect symmetry of the rest of the vast room. Feminine curiosity and the highly pressing need to uncover exactly who was trying to destroy them proved to be forces thousands of times more powerful than any moral restraints or the good, polite upbringing she had received. With her heart thundering loudly in her ears, feeling entirely like a common criminal investigating a crime scene, she leaned heavily over the polished wood and pulled, with two delicate fingers, one of the papers that was practically slipping out and about to fall onto the floor. Upon pulling it out and turning it toward the weak light filtering through the window, she instantly noticed that it was absolutely not a boring routine report counting stolen cattle, nor was it a tedious bank promissory note or a land deed. It was a deeply personal, incredibly old letter. The edges of the thin paper were highly irregular, frayed and severely yellowed by the relentless, cruel action of time and by years of repetitive, obsessive handling. The text had not been typed on a machine. It had been written entirely by hand, utilizing a strong, dark black ink, bearing the highly characteristic angular, rushed and incisive handwriting of Vincent himself. The date firmly stamped on the top right corner of the fragile page marked the distant month of August in the year 1916. 8 incredibly long years ago, an era when he was merely a young, dreaming rancher, and she was barely more than a little girl. Isabel brought the paper closer to her face to read the first few lines, and the very second she did, her heart skipped a massive beat, stopping painfully for one complete, terrifying second. The confessional letter did not speak a single word about cattle weights, the lucrative expansion of business deals, or abundant wheat harvests. It was a text that actively distilled pure, unadulterated bitterness, speaking incredibly painfully about an unforgivable, devastating betrayal. The thick text, heavily laden with a palpable, crushing pain that seemed to physically tear the page itself and bleed right through the long-dried ink, repeatedly mentioned, with a burning, white-hot rage, one highly specific name, Lionel, the very same Lionel Judson, the neighboring rancher with the pencil-thin mustache whom the townsfolk gossiped about in hushed, fearful whispers on street corners, calling him the biggest, richest, and absolute dirtiest rival Vincent had in the massive public land auctions run by the county. The angry, deeply tangled words scratched fiercely into the crumpled paper revealed dark, horrifying secrets. They revealed that Lionel was not merely an annoying, highly dishonest commercial competitor in the livestock business, but in harsh reality, a deeply intimate associate who had sneakily, maliciously stolen something extremely vital, profound, and entirely irreplaceable from Vincent's life in the past. The highly fragmented text clearly indicated a low, incredibly well-orchestrated blow that heavily involved bank fraud, the gross forgery of highly essential ranch documents, and, what frightened Isabel the absolute most, the dark, obscure involvement of a woman from his past. A woman to whom Vincent appeared to have entirely handed over his young, naive heart, and who, according to the devastating accounts contained within those desperate lines, had been cowardly bought, permanently silenced and taken far away by the highest possible price offered by Lionel. Isabel literally felt the thin air vanish from her lungs, a terrifying sensation of suffocation entirely taking over her body as she read the very last sentence of that unsent correspondence. It was a sentence that had been written with such tremendous raw brute force, with such massive contained fury, that the sharp metal tip of the fountain pen had actually pierced and brutally torn the paper in two completely distinct places. The burning, passionate love that the foolish poets sing so much about is a filthy, disgusting lie, a perverse, sick illusion that costs infinitely more than a man's own sanity and his very life. And I solemnly swear on the holy name of the God who created me, with every single ounce of strength in my being, that I will never, in any time or place, allow this pathetic, weak flaw to blind my eyes as a man, utterly destroy my honor in the dust, or empty my vaults for the twisted joy of cowardly scoundrels and traitors. The brutal, highly sudden impact of this entirely accidental discovery unraveled, in a mere fraction of a second, the highly complex mystery that heavily shrouded Vincent's dark, unyielding, and terrifyingly cold temperament. A profoundly painful epiphany hit her squarely in the chest. He was not, and quite possibly never had been, a man born completely without a beating heart, of a purely cold, sadistic nature or bad blood. Just as the ranch hands loved to gossip around the roaring campfires, quite the complete opposite. He was a highly principled man who had actively allowed himself to love in a tremendously intense, incredibly deep, and completely wide-open manner in the past. Someone who had surrendered himself entirely without any reservations, and as a cruel, twisted punishment for that total surrender, had been violently stabbed and betrayed in the back in the most vile, cowardly way imaginable, by the very woman he deeply loved, and by the greedy rival who violently coveted everything that was his. Following that devastating fall, Vincent had been severely forced by circumstances to completely rebuild his shattered life from the absolute ashes, brick by heavy brick, erecting with his own calloused hands an insurmountable, gigantic fortress wall of emotional ice, of pure, unadulterated distrust and silence, solely to manage to survive the gaping wound that still remained wide open and profusely bleeding inside his chest. The infamous, widely hated commercial marriage contract they had signed just a few short weeks ago. The highly absurd demand for the total absence of any feelings under the exact same roof. The incredibly rigid clauses that strictly guaranteed 6 months of programmed extreme coldness. Absolutely everything she had judged with so much burning hatred was not arrogance. It was not a blind, greedy grab for his grandfather's will, and it was certainly not the bloated ego of a wealthy man. That stiff, highly repellent posture was, in harsh reality, a desperate, steel-forged shield of protection against his own fragile human vulnerability. An impenetrable, massive defense mechanism created by a completely terrified, deeply bruised soul at the mere terrifying thought of being stabbed, robbed, and abandoned yet again by someone he foolishly dared to trust. Isabel felt her eyes burn violently and rapidly fill to the brim with hot, salty tears. A massive, heavy wave of deep comprehension, true solidarity, and overwhelming, crushing empathy rose powerfully from her stomach, completely replacing in the blink of an eye all that wounded pride and angry resistance that had constantly accompanied her over the last few weeks since the day of their infamous midnight engagement. Suddenly, the terrifying figure of the all-powerful, tyrannical, and widely feared cattle baron simply dissolved like morning fog under the hot sun in her mind, completely crumbling under the crushing weight of the newly discovered truth. All that remained standing before Isabel's imagination was merely the crystal-clear reflection of an immensely, deeply lonely man, secretly carrying ghosts that were far too painful and entirely too heavy for a single pair of human shoulders to bear without completely collapsing. It was in this exact, highly intimate and profoundly transformative moment of epiphany that a sudden, incredibly loud and highly aggressive noise coming from the stone courtyard outside violently shattered Isabel's deep trance like the sharp, dry crack of a leather whip. The highly strident sound of the heavy trot of not just one, but several very fast, untamed horses echoed noisily across the smooth, wet stones of the front pavement. The sharp, metallic clatter of heavy horseshoes, rhythmically and violently striking the wet ground, was immediately accompanied by the frantic, nervous, and highly aggressive barking of the pack of herding dogs that fiercely defended the borders of the main ranch house. She blinked rapidly to clear away the hot tears, quickly dropped the crumpled paper back onto the wooden desk as if it were physically burning her skin, closed the heavy drawer with extreme care so as not to make the slightest noise or leave any trace of her highly reckless invasion, and ran on the very tips of her boot-clad toes straight toward the massive, majestic window of the office. She strategically positioned herself sideways, hiding completely behind the opaque protection of the heavy, dark velvet curtain that covered the edges of the glass, perfectly concealing herself from whoever was outside in the grey, dreary morning light. Squinting her curious eyes and peering out exclusively through the millimetre-thin gap in the dark green fabric, Isabel's blood instantly froze in her veins at a dizzying speed, making her mouth go completely bone-dry in a second. Her stomach forcefully plummeted to the floor. The loud group that was arriving, violently breaking the funereal silence of that wet winter morning, was absolutely not her exhausted husband returning from patrolling the borders with his loyal men and the highly valuable recovered elite cattle. The man tightly pulling the reins and expertly dismounting from a truly beautiful, incredibly strong and massive buckskin horse right in the exact center of the main courtyard, wearing a highly elegant, long, and ridiculously expensive, authentic Peruvian wool poncho, and proudly sporting a blatantly mocking, cynical smile on his thin lips, was a man of average, unimpressive height. He possessed a sharply angled face, hair heavily slicked back, a millimetre perfectly trimmed moustache, and small eyes with a calculating, highly predatory and filthy gaze, which aggressively swept over the immense wealth of the manor's facade with highly visible, burning envy and pure greed. Isabel did not need any sort of formal, polite introduction from the extremely nervous ranch employees to immediately recognize the dark aura of profound, malicious arrogance that heavily emanated and was proudly stamped all over that face. It was Lionel Judson in the living flesh. The dark ghost from the past that bled so profusely in the letters locked in the office drawer had now physically materialized right there, breathing the freezing air of the ranch. Stepping brazenly on the highly sacred cobblestones of Vincent's property, with the arrogant authority of a bold invader who feared absolutely no retaliation. And Lionel had absolutely not gone all the way out there just for a simple, highly cordial morning visit between rural neighbors to shoot the breeze. He was there, standing in a deeply defiant manner, violently crushing the wet gravel directly in front of the majestic double doors of the Frontier Ranch's main headquarters. He was actively raising his voice high above the deafening, frantic barking of the furious dogs, ordering with arrogant authority that the completely astounded and heavily armed foremen lower their rifles immediately, arrogantly demanding, in a very loud and clear tone, to speak immediately and privately with the highly illustrious brand-new trophy wife of Vincent Alistair. What made Isabel's breathing fail completely and her weak legs tremble violently under the sheer weight of her own body was not merely his highly invasive, incredibly dangerous presence on the highly vulnerable property, while her husband and the true owner of it all was miles and miles away in the southern pastures, deeply focused on the stolen animals, but rather what the unwanted visitor was tightly holding in his fine leather-gloved hands. Lionel was triumphantly brandishing in the air, exactly as if it were a highly valuable bloody trophy of war violently conquered from a slaughtered enemy, a heavy, thick, and profoundly threatening rolled-up document bearing official letterheads. The document was heavily studded with large, dark red wax seals and official stamps from highly important city lawyers and state authorities that, even from a considerable safe distance from the window, Isabel could instinctively feel carried more than enough lethal poison to completely annul the contract and ruthlessly destroy, once and for all, the highly fragile, delicate house of cards that she and Vincent had barely begun trying to build to survive. The truly real, incredibly silent, and by far the most lethal challenge to the strictest, most lucrative, and absolute coldest contract ever officially registered by a county clerk in the entire vast history of the Montana Plains was, finally, and to Isabel's absolute despair, merely beginning to show its highly cruel, unforgiving face on that freezing, sunless winter morning. Isabel's heart was violently beating with such tremendous force against her ribs that she genuinely feared the loud sound could be easily heard right through the thick window pane of the office. Hidden safely behind the heavy, dark velvet curtain, she intently watched the highly arrogant figure of Lionel Judson standing in the ranch's courtyard. The freezing morning air of the plains seemed to have literally turned to ice inside her lungs, but the young woman's sharp mind was working at an absolutely terrifying speed. She knew perfectly well that if that slimy man stepped through the front doors with his hired thugs while Vincent was far away, the entire elaborate farce of the marriage would be completely, utterly ruined. Lionel was not there merely to make empty, pointless threats. He had come specifically to sniff out glaring weaknesses, to violently search for concrete proof that the union was nothing but a mere financial arrangement, and, with that evidence in hand, successfully usurp the rich lands and the highly lucrative export routes that rightfully belonged to her husband. Righteous indignation completely replaced her fear in the blink of an eye. Isabel vividly remembered the bitterly pained letter she had just read, the deep, silent agony that Vincent constantly carried entirely because of that very same man, and a fierce, violently protective, hot and completely uncontrollable fury forcefully took over every single cell in her body. She was absolutely no longer the highly fragile, desperate woman who had signed a bizarre contract out of pure desperation just to save her own crumbling house. She was now Isabel Alistair, the undisputed mistress of the frontier ranch, and she would absolutely not allow a filthy, opportunistic parasite to destroy the tiny bit of fragile peace that remained in that place. Without thinking twice, Isabel forcefully adjusted the collar of her thick wool coat, raised her chin high with a proud haughtiness that would make any European queen incredibly jealous, and marched with highly firm, fiercely decided steps right out of the office. She quickly crossed the long main hallway with an incredibly straight posture, the heavy heels of her riding boots echoing in a highly authoritative, intimidating manner against the waxed wooden floorboards. Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, was practically running from the kitchen area, with her eyes wide open in pure terror, frantically wiping her trembling hands on her white apron, nervously muttering that there were heavily armed men in the courtyard and that the loyal foremen were actively getting ready to shoot to kill. Isabel stopped dead in front of the panicked employee, placed a highly comforting, firm hand on the older woman's shaking shoulder, and ordered, with a voice that was impressively, almost terrifyingly calm and perfectly controlled, that Mrs. Higgins return immediately to her chores and explicitly tell the ranch hands not to fire a single shot unless she herself gave the direct, explicit order. The housekeeper blinked rapidly, completely taken aback by the unquestionable, fierce authority emanating from the new mistress. and nodded silently, quickly retreating into the safe depths of the massive manor. Isabel took a very deep breath, fully taking in the highly familiar scent of beeswax and burning wood in the grand foyer, forcefully turned the heavy iron key in the main door and yanked both solid wood panels open all at once, revealing herself proudly and defiantly to the outside world. The damp, absolutely freezing wind hit her pale face the very second she stepped onto the front porch, but she did not even flinch. Lionel, who was just about to arrogantly climb the first stone steps with a highly cynical, twisted smile drawn on his face, stopped completely dead in his tracks upon seeing the highly imposing feminine figure entirely blocking the entrance. The man with the pencil-thin moustache and the highly predatory gaze swept his eyes over Isabel from head to toe, carefully evaluating her with a sickening mixture of malicious curiosity and deep disdain. He smoothly removed his highly expensive felt hat in a deeply exaggerated gesture of entirely fake courtesy, offering a highly mocking theatrical bow, and stated in a very loud voice, ensuring that every single ranch hand around them heard, that it was an incredibly inestimable honor to finally meet the highly mysterious woman who had miraculously managed to tame the icy heart of the great Vincent Alastair. His tone was actively dripping with deadly venom and thick irony. Lionel confidently took one more step forward, waving the rolled-up legal document he carried in his hand, and inquisitively asked exactly where the lucky, blushing groom was hiding. Claiming he urgently needed to discuss highly pressing legal matters with the true owner of the property, Isabel did not back down a single millimeter. She firmly crossed her arms over her chest, locked her intense brown eyes squarely into the beady, deceitful eyes of the invader, and replied, with a cutting, absolute coldness that she herself didn't even know she possessed, that her husband was currently out patrolling the extensive borders of the property, but that absolutely any matter regarding the frontier ranch could, and strictly should, be dealt with directly with her, Vincent's legally wedded wife and full business partner. The highly audacious, bold response made Lionel let out a short, nasal, and highly irritating laugh, a grating sound that strongly resembled the cawing of a dark crow. He shook his head negatively in mock pity, slapped the rolled-up document against his own thigh, and explained, deliberately lowering his tone of voice a bit to sound highly threatening, that he was absolutely not there to chat over tea with fake window-dressing wives. He openly, brazenly declared that absolutely everyone in the entire region knew about the strict deadline in old man Alistair's will, and that the highly sudden, rushed marriage, secretly performed in a completely empty clerk's office right after Isabel had almost lost her own lands to the bank, was absolutely nothing more than a highly shameful, blatant fraud. Lionel stretched his arm out, proudly showing off the dark red wax seals on the paper, and revealed that the document was an official petition signed by a highly influential judge from the state capital, legally demanding a rigorous, thorough inspection of the house's private quarters to definitively prove that the two of them were absolutely not living as a real married couple. This would entirely annul Vincent's legal right to the massive inheritance and completely transfer the control of the highly lucrative exports to the other heirs, of whom Lionel, entirely coincidentally, had somehow managed to become the primary legal representative. He smiled in a highly perverse, victorious manner and aggressively demanded passage, stating that he would enter the house and personally check the bedrooms that very second. Isabel's blood was actively boiling, but her sharp mind remained perfectly, terrifyingly lucid and razor-sharp. She knew exactly that if he actually walked in and saw the massive master bedroom entirely untouched and all her personal belongings scattered across the east wing, everything they had built would be completely, irrecoverably lost. Offering a highly serene, entirely falsely sweet smile that perfectly masked her internal tension, Isabel took a bold step forward, getting dangerously, intimidatingly close to the edge of the porch, physically looking down from above at the arrogant rival. She told Lionel, in an incredibly soft, deeply venomous voice, that he was more than welcome to try and force his way into the house, but she fiercely warned him that if he took a single, solitary step further, without a proper search warrant legally issued by the local county judge and actively accompanied by the town's police force, the loyal ranch hands would have every single legal right in the world to defend the private property against a hostile invader with heavy gunfire. She highly discreetly pointed with her eyes toward the roofs of the storage barns, where 3 of Vincent's most trusted foremen already had their repeating rifles aimed directly, squarely at Lionel's chest and the chests of his hired thugs. Isabel smoothly continued, stating with absolute unwavering firmness that her highly sacred marriage was based entirely on a deep, profoundly private love that owed absolutely no explanations or satisfaction to bitter, deeply envious men. She boldly concluded her flawless defense by declaring that Vincent would surely return at any given moment, and that, if Lionel was still standing there trespassing when that happened, her husband would absolutely not be nearly as diplomatic or polite as she was being. The completely unshakable confidence and the fiercely protective posture of Isabel caught Lionel entirely, utterly off guard. He visibly hesitated, looking highly nervously back and forth between the armed men on the roofs and the fiercely courageous, blazing eyes of the woman standing right in front of him. The cynical, mocking smile completely vanished from his face, entirely replaced by a highly twisted expression of barely contained rage. He acutely realized that he had massively underestimated the young woman, foolishly believing he would find a terrified, highly submissive farm girl and absolutely not a fierce lioness, entirely willing to physically protect her own territory. Hissing in pure frustration, Lionel forcefully shoved the document back into the inner pocket of his expensive poncho, slammed his hat back onto his head with a highly abrupt, angry movement, and loudly warned her, his voice heavily laden with pure hatred, that the battle was far from over. He swore to God he would return with the town judge, that he would publicly, humiliatingly unmask their pathetic farce to all of high society during the grand winter ball, taking place in just a few short weeks, and that he would laugh uproariously when the 2 of them were forcefully kicked off those lands like stray dogs. Without waiting for a single response, he spun violently on his heels, clumsily mounted his horse in anger, and rode off at a full, frantic gallop with his men, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a thick cloud of swirling dust and the loud sound of the dogs barking. The very second the hostile group of invaders disappeared around the sharp curve of the dirt road, Isabel's tense shoulders completely caved in, and she leaned heavily against the thick wooden column of the porch. Finally releasing the breath she hadn't even realized she was desperately holding. Her weak legs were trembling so violently that she genuinely felt she might completely collapse onto the hard ground at any given instant. Mrs. Higgins appeared hastily at the front door, carrying a glass of sugar water, softly murmuring high praise for the tremendous courage of her mistress. But Isabel merely thanked her with a weak nod, feeling the immense gravity of what had just transpired. She had boldly lied to the law, fiercely threatened armed men, and aggressively defended Vincent with a burning passion that completely terrified her. The deeply cold, utterly feelingless agreement had been completely and irreversibly broken the very exact moment she actively decided to fight his personal war as if it were her very own. The tense hours dragged on agonizingly for the rest of the long day. The pale, weak winter sun slowly crossed the sky without managing to warm the frozen earth, and the twilight was already painting the vast horizon with highly melancholic, deep purple hues when the absolutely unmistakable heavy sound of exhausted hooves loudly announced the return of the master of the ranch. Isabel was sitting rigidly in an armchair near the roaring fireplace in the living room, her hands nervously and repeatedly squeezing the fabric of her own dress. The heavy front door opened with a loud, forceful crash, and Vincent stepped heavily into the foyer. He was completely, utterly unrecognizable. His expensive leather boots were thickly caked in dark, heavy mud up to his knees. His face was heavily smeared with dirt and black soot, and a thin, highly visible line of dried blood marked the side of his tightly clenched jaw, actively proving that the desperate search for the stolen animals had been anything but peaceful. He violently tossed his soaking wet hat onto a side table and walked with incredibly heavy steps into the room, stopping dead in his tracks abruptly upon seeing Isabel anxiously waiting for him near the warm fire. Before we continue to dive deep into the raw emotions of this incredibly tense night and discover exactly how this highly complex relationship is going to permanently transform, do not forget to leave your like right here on the video and aggressively subscribe to the Tales of Yesteryear channel. Your active subscription is absolutely fundamental so that I can continue to bring you these highly emotional, deeply moving stories full of incredible perseverance to completely warm your heart every single week. Ring that notification bell and come be a part of our growing family. Vincent took an incredibly deep, shaky breath, looking exactly as if he were carrying the heavy weight of the entire world on his broad, tired shoulders. With a voice that was noticeably much hoarser than usual, completely and utterly exhausted down to the very marrow of his bones, he quietly informed Isabel that they had managed to successfully recover the vast majority of the expensive elite cattle in a steep canyon near the border, but that the cowardly thieves had managed to easily slip away under the perfect cover of the thick, heavy fog. He walked very slowly toward the roaring fireplace, holding out his large, calloused hands to the comforting heat of the flames, and softly murmured, acting almost as if he were merely talking to himself, that the clean cutting of the fence and the massive theft of the animals had been absolutely nothing more than a very cheap, highly planned distraction, a calculated decoy specifically designed to lure him far away from the main ranch house and purposefully leave it entirely, highly unprotected. Isabel swallowed hard, slowly stood up from her comfortable armchair, and, with an incredibly soft, gentle voice, completely confirmed his worst, darkest suspicions. She meticulously narrated in highly vivid detail absolutely everything that had transpired during the morning, starting from the sudden, highly aggressive arrival of Lionel Judson to the violent threats concerning the judge's legal document, the impending deep investigation into their marriage, and the highly dangerous accusations of financial fraud. She told him exactly how she had fiercely confronted his bitter rival, boldly lied right to his face about the true nature of their relationship, and aggressively threatened the armed men with gunfire, successfully preventing them from entering the house and discovering the damning, undeniable truth about the separate bedrooms. While she spoke, Vincent completely stopped moving. He slowly lowered the hands he had been warming by the fire and turned around very, very slowly to look her directly in the face. His dark eyes, which were normally so completely unreadable and perfectly, rigidly controlled, were now wide open and shining brilliantly, with a highly complex, overwhelming mixture of absolute total shock, profound admiration, and something that looked incredibly, undeniably similar to deep reverence. He listened to every single word she said in a deeply reverential, heavy silence. When Isabel finally finished her tense tale, apologizing profusely for having acted entirely on her own accord and for having potentially put the massive ranch at severe risk by purposely provoking Lionel, Vincent took a large, deliberate step in her direction. The physical distance between the two of them seemed to shrink in a highly electrifying magnetic manner. He was absolutely not furious. He was absolutely not cold. The centuries-old massive wall of solid ice that tightly encased the heart of that man seemed to audibly, violently crack right then and there, directly in front of the crackling fireplace. He asked her, with a deeply shaky voice that barely managed to pass as a whisper heavily laden with contained raw emotion, exactly why she had done that. Why hadn't she simply stepped aside, let Lionel walk right in, let the entire elaborate farce violently crumble to the ground, and just collected her agreed-upon payout, fleeing far away from all that massive, dangerous mess forever? Isabel looked incredibly deeply into his dark eyes, no longer seeing the ruthless, highly implacable businessman, but rather the deeply wounded gentleman who had carefully covered her shivering body with a warm blanket during the frightening storm. She replied with the raw, brutal honesty of someone who has absolutely nothing left in the world to lose, that she would never, ever accept seeing the good honor of a decent man be violently destroyed by cowardly opportunists right under his very own roof. She firmly stated that the written agreement might be entirely cold on paper, but that she was made of flesh, bone, and fierce loyalty, and she would never, ever abandon a partner right in the middle of a deadly ambush. The highly bold response completely, utterly disarmed Vincent. Without thinking for a single second about the highly strict, rigid rules he himself had so carefully created, without caring in the slightest about the heavy, dirty mud on his clothes or the strict contractual restrictions, he slowly raised his large right hand and, using the very tips of his rough, heavily calloused fingers, incredibly softly touched Isabel's face. It was a completely different touch from the highly accidental one that had occurred on the night of the violent storm. This time, it was absolutely not accidental. It was deeply intentional, lingering, and heavily laden with a gratitude so immense, so profound, that it made the young woman's heart race out of control. He gently traced the delicate line of her cheek, truly feeling the soft skin beneath his rough calluses, and softly murmured that absolutely no one in his entire lonely life had ever willingly placed themselves directly in front of a deadly threat just to defend him. He had always been the strong, unbreakable shield for everyone else around him, but he had never, ever had someone step up to be his. In that highly charged instant, the heavy silence they shared was absolutely no longer made of awkward strangeness or cold distance, but rather of a newly born, incredibly warm, and overwhelmingly powerful intimacy. Vincent very reluctantly pulled his hand back, cleared his heavily choked throat, and his deep tone of voice once again assumed the serious, rigid tone of business. But his dark eyes remained entirely fixed on hers with an unprecedented, highly unexpected sweetness. He carefully explained that Lionel was a highly dangerous, deeply vindictive man who would absolutely never rest until he definitively proved that the marriage was a total fraud. Vincent declared that the highly anticipated annual winter ball, which was scheduled to take place in exactly 3 weeks at the town's Central Club, would undeniably be the final, ultimate battlefield. All of high society, including the highly suspicious county judge and the family's top lawyers, would be present, actively and meticulously observing their every single movement, every stolen glance, and every single sigh they shared. If they failed to completely and utterly convince every single person in that room that they were madly, unconditionally, and desperately in love with one another, they would lose absolutely everything. He stated, with a cutting, intense seriousness, that starting from that very exact moment, the fake farce needed to become entirely, undeniably real inside the private walls of the house, so that it would appear absolutely flawless on the outside. They could absolutely no longer live like complete strangers under the same roof. Otherwise, The tiniest, most microscopic slip-ups would surely betray them before Lionel's sharp, predatory eyes. The highly silent, unspoken agreement that formed powerfully between them that night drastically and permanently altered the freezing atmosphere of the frontier ranch. The long, solitary days and the highly awkward dinners at the exact opposite ends of the massive table were immediately and completely abolished. A true, rapid leap in time officially began, and the 3 highly intense weeks that followed rapidly transformed into a deeply intoxicating, passionate rehearsal of love that very gradually ceased to be acting. Vincent ordered Mrs. Higgins to start serving all of their daily meals at the much smaller, intimate table on the glass-enclosed porch, where he and Isabel began to sit very closely, directly side by side. In the very beginning, the conversations were somewhat mechanical, desperately trying to memorize small details about each other's childhoods, just so they wouldn't make a fatal mistake in public. But as the days rapidly passed, the stiff formalities began melting entirely under the warm heat of their daily, close coexistence. Vincent slowly began telling her long stories about his grandparents, about the difficult founding of the massive ranch, and about his deep, profound love for horses, actively allowing the usual harshness of his voice to give way to a highly velvety, nostalgic and gentle tone. Isabel, in turn, openly shared highly cherished memories of her father, of her absolute favorite books, and of her long-dormant dreams. And whenever she spoke, she acutely noticed that Vincent watched her with a highly intense, almost hypnotic attention, exactly as if her spoken words were the absolute most valuable thing he had ever heard in his life. The massive changes absolutely did not stop merely at words. Vincent, who was usually so incredibly austere and distant, began to actively seek out highly subtle, physical pretexts to get closer to her. On one particularly sunny Sunday afternoon, he invited her to accompany him to the large stables, gently teaching her how to properly feed the newborn foals. When Isabel nervously reached out her hand to pet the soft muzzle of a highly agitated animal, Vincent quietly positioned himself directly behind her, his warm breath hitting the sensitive skin of her neck, and gently guided her hand with his own, his thick, rough fingers intertwining with hers in a highly natural, intimate way. The electric, highly charged physical contact lasted much, much longer than was absolutely necessary to calm the horse. On another occasion, right after dinner, he found her quietly reading in the library, walked straight over to the antique record player in the corner of the room, and put on a vinyl record to play a very slow, soft melody. Without asking for any permission, he held out his large hand to her, arguing with a highly charming half-smile that they desperately needed to practice their dance steps so they wouldn't embarrass themselves at the grand ball. Isabel accepted his warm hand, and when Vincent pulled her firmly against his broad, solid chest, placing his strong hand on her narrow waist, the entire world around them seemed to instantly disappear. They twirled slowly across the Persian rug, in a highly charged silence full of subtle flirts, deeply lingering looks, and a romantic tension so incredibly dense it could have easily been cut with a silver knife. With every single passing day, the highly invisible line that separated acting for survival from genuinely real, deep feelings became increasingly blurred and entirely imperceptible to both of them. Finally, the highly anticipated night of the grand winter ball arrived, bringing with it the crushing, heavy weight of a massive social tribunal. The grand manor was in an absolute frenzy of frantic preparations. Isabel, locked in her large bedroom, was finishing getting ready in front of the full-length mirror. She was wearing an absolutely stunning, pure silk gown in a deep, rich burgundy color, a shade that contrasted perfectly with the elegant paleness of her skin and brilliantly highlighted the striking color of her brown eyes. The highly noble, expensive fabric specially purchased by Vincent weeks earlier at the finest boutique in town, exclusively for this occasion, fell flawlessly down her body, heavily exuding pure elegance and power. Her dark hair was pinned up in a highly sophisticated, elegant style, adorned merely by a few highly discreet pearl clips. When she finally opened the bedroom door and began to descend the immense, sweeping main staircase, Vincent was waiting for her on the lower landing. He looked absolutely spectacular in an impeccably tailored, fine black tuxedo, his hair perfectly combed, holding the highly confident posture of an absolute lord. Hearing her soft footsteps, he raised his dark eyes, and exactly what Isabel saw plainly on his face completely took her breath away. The terrifying man of ice looked at her with an admiration so incredibly pure, intensely deep, and entirely disarmed that it seemed as if he were staring at a living, breathing miracle materialized right in front of him. Vincent swallowed very hard, walked slowly to the very base of the staircase, and extended his hand to her. When her delicate fingers rested softly upon his, he gently brought the back of her hand to his lips and deposited a very warm, lingering kiss, praising her breathtaking beauty with a highly hoarse, low whisper that made Isabel's cheeks flush a furious bright red. The bumpy carriage ride all the way to town was conducted in a highly expectant, heavy silence, their hands resting incredibly close to each other on the leather seat, practically brushing against one another. The central town club was brightly, brilliantly illuminated, absolutely full of gleaming crystal chandeliers, massively expensive floral arrangements, and live orchestras playing highly elaborate, sweeping waltzes. The strong scent of expensive French perfumes, imported cigars, and roasting meats mixed heavily in the heated air of the overcrowded ballroom. When Vincent and Isabel finally walked through the heavy double doors of the grand hall, a momentary, highly noticeable quietness descended completely upon the hundreds of guests. Every single gaze, highly curious and deeply judgmental, turned simultaneously toward the highly gossiped-about couple. Vincent, acutely feeling the intense nervousness of his wife, firmly intertwined his fingers with hers, squeezed tightly, placed his arm in a highly protective and undeniably possessive manner around her small waist, and confidently guided her into the crowded room with the highly imposing posture of a proud king, accompanied by his undisputed gorgeous queen. It didn't take even 10 short minutes for the deadly threat to violently materialize. Lionel Judson, wearing a sharply tailored suit and casually holding a crystal glass of champagne, aggressively pushed his way through the crowded guests until he stopped dead directly in front of the couple, heavily accompanied by a severe, highly serious elderly gentleman wearing gold-rimmed glasses, whom Isabel very quickly deduced was the highly feared county judge. Lionel's twisted smile was far more venomous and toxic than ever before. He greeted Vincent with a highly fake, mocking nod of his head and rapidly directed his full attention entirely to Isabel, loudly praising her appearance with highly chosen words that sounded exactly like thinly veiled insults, with a highly calculated, malicious audacity designed exclusively to provoke a highly explosive reaction and cause a massive public scandal. Lionel asked Isabel, in a tone of voice loud enough for the nearby judge and the surrounding wealthy ranchers to clearly hear, if she didn't deeply fear that Vincent's highly sudden, intense love was just as fake and easily bought as the supposed loyalty of the woman who had cruelly abandoned him in the past in exchange for a few shiny gold coins. The highly cruel, incredibly direct mention of the exact betrayal that had completely shattered Vincent's life years ago was exactly like a cold, sharp blade, violently cutting right through the festive, happy atmosphere of the ballroom. Isabel felt Vincent's massive body go entirely rigid against hers, the strong muscles of his jaw visibly popping under the skin as he fought desperately with all his might. To contain his blinding fury and not completely smash the rival's face in right then and there, which would undeniably ruin absolutely everything they had planned. But right before Vincent could make a highly impulsive, deadly mistake, driven entirely by the newly reopened pain, Isabel squeezed his strong arm in a highly firm signal for calm, boldly took a large step forward, symbolically placing herself entirely between her furious husband and the threat, and flashed the absolute most radiant, highly confident, and deeply condescending smile she could possibly muster. With a highly melodious voice, yet one heavily laden with a cutting, razor-sharp firmness, she confidently answered Lionel that the dark past was absolutely nothing more than a highly rigorous teacher that taught men of true, undeniable value how to clearly recognize a genuine, highly precious jewel when they finally, truly found it. She smoothly continued, staring intensely and unblinkingly straight into Lionel's predatory small eyes, stating clearly that she felt incredibly, deeply sorry for miserable men who desperately needed to buy highly ephemeral fake affection with gold coins and cheap blackmail, because those pathetic types would absolutely never, ever know the unshakable true loyalty and the burning, passionate love that is born entirely of deep mutual respect, the exact things that she and her loving husband actively built together every single day in the highly sacred privacy of their home. The response was so incredibly precise, so highly elegant and completely crushing, that the county judge raised his eyebrows in clear, highly visible approval, softly murmuring words of complete agreement and visible enchantment with the profound wisdom of the young, beautiful wife. While Lionel's face completely, utterly lost all of its color, violently twisting into a highly visible grimace of poorly hidden frustration at having entirely failed to provoke the explosive, violent reaction he had so carefully planned. Quickly seizing the highly perfect moment of undeniable complete victory, Vincent didn't waste a single second. With a highly brilliant flash of pure, unadulterated pride in his dark eyes, he highly politely excused himself from the gentleman, firmly grabbed Isabel's hand, and confidently led her with very steady steps directly into the exact center of the packed dance floor, right under the absolute largest crystal chandelier in the entire room. The orchestra immediately began to play a highly slow, deeply enveloping waltz. Vincent pulled Isabel very firmly against him, significantly closer than the highly strict, formal public decorum allowed. He placed his large, very warm hand in a highly possessive, firm manner on the small of her back, while his other hand tightly and firmly intertwined his fingers with hers. They began to dance smoothly and flawlessly, gliding across the highly polished marble floor in perfect, beautiful synchrony, exactly as if they had done that together their entire lives. During the highly romantic dance, the entire outside world completely, totally evaporated for both of them. Lionel absolutely no longer existed, nor did the judge, the will, the massive debts, or the inheritances. All that existed were Vincent's highly intense dark brown eyes diving deeply, profoundly into the very depths of Isabel's soul. He leaned his head down, softly brushing his lips against her ear, and whispered, with a voice completely choked with heavy emotion, that she had been the absolute most magnificent, incredibly fearless, and totally extraordinary thing he had ever seen in his entire life. Isabel closed her eyes for a highly brief, perfect instant, completely intoxicated by the highly familiar, wonderful scent of pine and lye soap that heavily emanated from him, and rested her head softly on her husband's broad, strong shoulder, feeling the highly strong, rhythmic and heavy beats of Vincent's heart directly against her own chest. In that highly long, absolutely perfect moment of open, highly public flirtation and blatant, obvious affection, dancing beautifully right under the highly judgmental eyes of the entire town, both of them suddenly had the most absolute, highly terrifying and undeniable certainty. They were absolutely no longer pretending. The freezing, highly commercial contract had completely and utterly turned to ashes, successfully making way for a highly silent, completely overwhelming, and desperately real burning passion that actively heated the blood in both of their veins. The grand ball finally ended in a highly glorious manner, with the beautiful couple being heavily applauded and deeply respected by all of high society, perfectly and entirely dissipating all the nasty doubts planted by their rivals and provisionally, safely guaranteeing the absolute security of the will in the strict eyes of the law. The long, bumpy ride back to the frontier ranch during the cold, highly starry dawn was entirely filled with stolen, deeply intense glances, highly subtle, soft smiles, and shoulders that purposefully brushed against each other with every single bump of the carriage, building a highly sweet, heavily romantic tension that highly promised brand new, wonderful beginnings. However, the highly intoxicating deep joy of that glorious night of absolute triumph and emotional, profound discoveries was just about to be highly, brutally, violently interrupted by the incredibly harsh reality of the shadows. When they finally, happily arrived in the dark courtyard of the massive ranch, completely exhausted but with their hearts absolutely overflowing with high hope and brand new, powerful feelings, the absolute tranquility of the perfect moment was violently shattered. The heavy front door of the large manor was slightly, highly ominously ajar. Vincent violently jumped from the carriage, his deeply ingrained protective instincts on highly maximum alert, immediately ordering Isabel to stay safely behind him. They quickly entered the silent, highly gloomy foyer and ran at full speed directly toward the west wing. The highly terrifying scene they encountered in the hallway made Isabel's blood run completely ice-cold, and all the wonderful warmth of the new romance completely evaporated in a matter of seconds. The highly heavy, solid double doors of Vincent's private, locked office had been violently, brutally forced open, with the highly carved wood heavily splintered and the highly expensive brass lock completely destroyed and lying on the floor. The interior of the once highly organized, perfect sanctuary was in a state of absolute, complete chaos. Tall bookshelves had been violently knocked over, thick accounting ledgers had been brutally torn apart and thrown everywhere across the heavily mud-stained rug, and the immense, highly heavy mahogany desk was violently flipped onto its side. Lionel absolutely had not gone to the ball merely to provoke them in public. His highly noticeable presence in the brightly lit ballroom had been a highly cruel, cheap, and nasty trick to ensure, without a shadow of a doubt, that the owners would be very far away from the property, while his hired thugs violently did the highly dirty work under the perfect cover of the night. Vincent ran desperately, blindly, toward the heavy wreckage in the far corner of the destroyed room, frantically feeling the dark, empty hole of a highly secret, small safe hidden behind the antique bookshelf, which had been violently, brutally forced open and completely emptied. He slowly turned toward Isabel, his face entirely pale and heavily drawn with a highly terrifying expression of pure, unadulterated terror and blinding fury mixed together. His voice came out in a highly scratched, desperately hoarse whisper, revealing the highly imminent, fatal tragedy that heavily hung over them. The invaders had found and violently stolen the original, highly secret document of the commercial marriage contract, the one and only highly irrefutable, physically signed proof that their union had originally begun as a highly cold, strictly financial negotiation with a strict, non-negotiable expiration date of 6 months, was now securely in the highly unscrupulous, dirty hands of the enemy, absolutely ready to be used as a highly lethal, deadly weapon to completely destroy not only the massive estate, but the entire, highly promising future of the newly discovered, burning love that had merely just begun to beautiful bloom within the highly protected walls of that house. The highly bitter, metallic smell of kicked-up dust, violently splintered wood, and burned gunpowder lingering heavily in the destroyed lock entirely permeated the air of the completely wrecked office, violently transforming what was once a highly organized refuge into a highly devastating scene of war and total desolation. Isabel remained entirely, completely paralyzed on the threshold of the violently broken door, her large brown eyes completely wide open in absolute shock, entirely incapable of fully processing the highly massive magnitude of the absolute disaster unfolding right before her. The gorgeous, highly expensive burgundy silk dress she had worn to the ball, which just a few short hours earlier had made her feel exactly like an absolute undisputed queen, dancing beautifully in the strong arms of the man she was actively learning to deeply love, now felt incredibly heavily out of place amidst that highly brutal destruction. Vincent was on his knees, on the very dirty floor, his highly large, visibly trembling hands tightly gripping the heavily twisted metal edges of the completely empty safe. His breathing came out highly ragged, incredibly heavy, and highly irregular, exactly like a wildly cornered animal that has suddenly realized the deadly trap has violently snapped shut around it. The harsh, incredibly brutal reality of the facts was absolutely overwhelming. Lionel Judson had played incredibly dirty, unbelievably low, and had not merely actively threatened the highly lucrative stability of the ranch. He had violently stolen the absolute definitive, completely undeniable proof, highly signed with fresh ink, that the entire elaborate marriage had originally started as a highly feelingless, strictly commercial transaction. Vincent slowly, painfully raised his face, and the highly raw, crushing pain that Isabel saw heavily stamped on the highly hardened features of her husband violently broke her heart into 1,000 tiny, miserable pieces. That entire highly imposing, massive fortress wall of emotional ice, of highly guarded invulnerability and absolute total control that he always proudly displayed as an entirely insurmountable shield, had completely, utterly crumbled right there, on the dirty floor of that destroyed office, leaving absolutely nothing but a deeply wounded, completely exhausted, and highly terrified man, utterly horrified at the thought of losing absolutely everything all over again. He swallowed incredibly hard, and with a highly harsh, heavily raspy voice, actively scratched by crushing, absolute frustration, confessed to Isabel that it was entirely, completely over. He explained, entirely devoid of hope, that with the highly detailed original contract in his possession, which meticulously detailed the cash payments and the strict 6-month validity period for the entire fake marriage, Lionel absolutely no longer needed highly suspicious local judges or highly malicious, nasty gossip in the town salons. The cowardly rival had highly lethal, deadly ammunition, more than enough to march confidently straight into the central clerk's office in the state capital very early, the very next morning, legally, officially, annul the union completely due to highly proven fraud, violently seize full control of the highly lucrative cattle export routes through the legal will, and, as a highly final, crushing blow of petty vengeance for incredibly old grudges, violently kick both of them completely off the highly valuable lands of the frontier ranch without leaving them a single, miserable dime to start over. Isabel felt her highly weak legs give way, her knees actively trembling violently beneath her highly voluminous skirt, and she desperately had to physically lean heavily against the splintered doorframe just so she wouldn't completely collapse to the ground. The highly perverse, incredibly painful irony of the highly desperate situation hit her exactly like a brutal punch straight to the stomach. Right now, on this exact, highly specific night when they had finally truly shattered the heavy chains of their rehearsed fake distancing, on the exact same beautiful night, they had smoothly danced under the bright light of the crystal chandeliers, sharing highly intense looks that practically screamed a highly developing, burning, and undeniable love, On the exact same night, the highly sweet promise of a completely real, deeply warm future had actively begun to bloom wonderfully in the heavily bruised hearts of both of them. The dark past was violently, treacherously resurfacing from the shadows to cruelly rip away absolutely any tiny hope of lasting, true happiness. She looked heavily down at her own small hands, still vividly feeling the highly warm heat and the ghost-like pressure of Vincent's strong fingers during the waltz. The highly freezing, icy fear threatened to completely paralyze her, highly insidiously whispering in her ears that she should simply quietly pack her highly worn small leather suitcase and flee far away from there. After all, the highly strict 6-month deadline of the contract hadn't even officially expired, and she was entirely permanently free of her late father's heavy, cursed debts. She could highly easily just walk right out into the freezing dawn and save herself entirely. However, upon highly looking back up at Vincent, who was now highly automatically and entirely blankly picking up the violently torn pieces of paper from the floor, exactly as if he were pathetically trying to piece back together a completely destroyed, ruined life, Isabel made a highly irreversible, profoundly transformative decision. The highly soft, gentle fire of the romantic passion that had warmly heated her on the crowded dance floor instantaneously, violently transformed into a highly furious, roaring inferno of fiercely protective loyalty and highly wild, untamed determination. She was absolutely, definitely not a highly pathetic coward. She was not the incredibly weak, scared woman from the past that he so heavily, constantly feared. And highly above absolutely everything else, she would absolutely not permit, under any highly celestial or completely infernal hypothesis, that this truly incredible, good man, who had generously paid off her massive debts and highly gently cared for her shivering cold during the violent storm with a warm blanket and highly gentle words, be violently trampled, ruthlessly robbed, and deeply humiliated by a highly envious, pathetic worm like Lionel. If the highly damning original contract was completely in the hands of the bitter enemy, actively proving that the highly complex marriage had started as a completely cold business, the single, highly desperate, and only way out was to actively prove, in a far louder, highly incontestable and incredibly public manner, that the highly burning reality of the true heart had completely, permanently altered the highly strict destiny of the black letters written on that paper. With highly firm, fiercely bold steps that completely, actively ignored the heavy dirt of the floor, ruining her highly expensive silk dress, Isabel quickly crossed the short distance that physically separated them. She aggressively fell to her knees right directly in front of Vincent, right in the middle of the absolute chaos of the scattered, torn paperwork. Entirely not caring in the slightest about the highly dirty mud or the thick dust that violently stained the expensive nobility of her fine clothing. She fiercely grabbed the rancher's highly pale face with both of her hands, her incredibly hot, warm palms violently, heavily contrasting with the freezing, highly trembling, and pale skin of his tense cheeks, and physically forced him, with a highly authoritative, fierce delicacy, to lift his heavy chin and look directly, deeply into the very back of her highly determined brown eyes. Vincent rapidly blinked, completely, utterly surprised by the highly sudden, fierce strength of that incredible woman. With a highly steady voice that was pure, strong steel, tempered entirely in hot fire, violently cutting through the funereal dead silence of the ruined dawn, Isabel openly, loudly declared that absolutely everything was not entirely over. Not highly, unless he completely decided to pathetically surrender right there and then without putting up a massive fight. She stated with highly burning fervor that a highly old, dusty piece of paper covered in ink signatures did absolutely not dictate the true, highly powerful feelings of two living souls, that highly cold, strict contracts could easily be violently torn to shreds, and that Lionel could highly well take that damned paper straight to the depths of hell, because the highly undeniable, burning truth they felt for each other in the crowded ballroom could absolutely not be locked away in a small metal safe, much less cowardly stolen by cheap, highly pathetic mercenaries. Vincent took a highly deep, shaky breath, actively smelling the highly sweet, comforting scent of vanilla that strongly emanated from her warm skin, heavily mixing with the highly bitter smell of dust in the room, and the deep, crushing pain in his eyes slowly began to give way to a highly vacillating tiny spark of deep confusion and heavily contained hope. He highly softly murmured, his deep voice heavily failing him dangerously, desperately asking exactly what she possibly intended to do, logically arguing that the strict law was highly cold, highly mathematical, completely blind to all human feelings, and would absolutely not ever forgive the highly proven financial fraud legally registered in the violently stolen document, no matter how much they desperately swore highly eternal, burning love in front of 100 completely different, strict judges. Isabel smiled, a highly small, fierce, incredibly astute and profoundly courageous smile. She slowly slid her highly warm hands gently down his thick neck, softly smoothing out the highly tense, broad shoulders covered by the thin fabric of his tuxedo. She rapidly and highly precisely explained her bold idea, the complex plan forming perfectly in her highly brilliant mind, like a highly intricate, detailed embroidery. Lionel actively possessed the damning document, but he absolutely did highly not have the time on his side. The early morning passenger train that the cowardly scoundrel would highly inevitably take to eagerly carry the paper straight to the central clerk's office in the state capital, where he deeply intended to legally register the official annulment, would only depart from the local town station at exactly 6:30 at dawn. There were merely a little over 4 highly short, desperate hours left before the pale sun began to slowly peek over the grey horizon and the train loudly blew its whistle to depart. If they somehow miraculously managed to reach the busy station before Lionel could physically board the train and caused a highly colossal, massive, public scandal right in front of the entire town, of highly important authorities, of all the sleepy travellers, and the railway employees. If they, actively acting exactly like a highly furious, deeply and passionately in love married couple, completely unmasked the violent robbery right there, screaming at the top of their lungs, they would instantaneously, violently transform the rival's supposed triumphant victory into a highly flagrant, undeniable crime of violent breaking and entering, theft of private, highly personal property, and blatant extortion, completely invalidating any highly legal power that the stolen piece of paper might possibly have in a court of law. The highly daring plan was incredibly dangerous, profoundly risky, highly desperate, aggressively scandalous, and depended entirely, completely on them arriving exactly on time. But it was absolutely the only highly viable alternative to not completely losing the massive war in total silence. Vincent looked highly, deeply, intensely at Isabel, actively, completely absorbing the highly massive magnitude of the bold audacity and the fierce courage of that entirely extraordinary woman whom he had once highly foolishly judged to be merely a small pawn in his complex chess game for a massive inheritance. The highly ancient thick wall of solid ice finally completely finished, melting away entirely, making huge room for a highly burning, deep admiration and a profoundly deep, highly mature and absolutely undeniable love that violently and overwhelmingly dominated him. He absolutely no longer highly needed to pretend absolutely anything at all. Without asking for any sort of permission, entirely and completely guided solely by the highly primitive, raw instinct of possession and profound gratitude that heavily overflowed from his large chest, He brought his highly large, strong hands to Isabel's waist and pulled her violently, powerfully against him, tightly crushing her in a highly desperate, heavy embrace. Vincent buried his highly tense face deep into the warm, highly soft curve of her neck, desperately breathing in her scent exactly as if it were highly pure, life-saving oxygen. His voice came out highly choked, a completely hoarse whisper right against her skin, deeply confessing that he was absolutely terrified, not because of potentially losing the damned inherited lands of his ancestors or the massive money from the exports, but highly because of the absolute, crushing terror of deeply losing her, of highly losing the bright light that she had miraculously brought into that highly empty, freezing house, and the highly silent, sweet joy she had happily returned to his highly monotonous dark days. Isabel felt the highly hot burning tears of pure, unadulterated emotion fiercely sting and run rapidly down her own face, and in a highly open gesture of absolute, total surrender and deep trust, completely returned his desperate embrace with all her might, sinking her fingers deeply into her husband's dark hair, passionately answering in a highly encouraging whisper that, highly as long as they were standing strong and together, actively facing the entire world directly side by side, absolutely no one would ever lose anyone. The highly despairing, crushing inertia had been completely broken. There wasn't a single, highly precious minute to waste crying over highly torn pieces of paper. Vincent rapidly rose from the dirty floor with the high agility of a highly dangerous, predatory feline, pulling Isabel firmly by the hand with care, but in extreme haste. He loudly, aggressively bellowed strict orders out into the dark hallways, violently waking up his highly trusted head foreman, who was deeply sleeping in the back bunkhouse. In a matter of highly short, completely frantic minutes, the absolute fastest, incredibly strongest, and highly most resilient horses of the frontier ranch were hastily saddled under the highly weak, flickering light of the kerosene lanterns. There was absolutely no highly practical or safe time to hitch the highly luxurious carriage or seek any sort of comfort for the brutal trip. Isabel absolutely didn't even highly bother to change out of her ruined, highly expensive silk dress. She merely pulled on her highly inseparable, sturdy riding boots again, threw a highly heavy, dark, thick wool coat right over her fine ball gown to physically protect herself from the highly biting, cutting frost of the early morning, and mounted highly agilely onto the saddle of the strong, sorrel horse that was quickly brought to her. Vincent highly forcefully mounted his imposing, massive black stallion, his face heavily marked now absolutely no longer by crushing pain or deep despair, but rather by a highly controlled, incredibly cold, profoundly obstinate, and absolutely lethal fury. The highly implacable, terrifying expression of a highly dangerous man who would absolutely not hesitate for a second to violently destroy the entire world to fiercely protect exactly what rightfully belonged to him by highly divine. Righton was completely conquered by the heart. The highly long, desperately frantic, and entirely mind-bending ride through the highly dense, freezing, and deeply oppressive darkness of the Montana plains was a truly painful, highly implacable, and brutal test of sheer physical, highly emotional, and animal endurance. The damp, absolutely freezing wind beat violently and completely without mercy, directly against the pale faces of both of them, exactly as if they were highly invisible, sharp whips of cutting ice. The deep, grave, and highly rhythmic sound of the heavy iron horseshoes, forcefully, desperately striking the highly uneven, dry dirt road, echoed loudly in the deeply silent early morning, exactly like the tireless, frantic trot of the horses of death itself, aggressively racing against the highly strict clock of destiny. Isabel deeply felt the thin, highly tired muscles of her legs and arms severely burn with the highly continuous, heavily exhausting physical effort of actively maintaining the highly brutal pace imposed, but highly, every single time, the highly imminent, crushing exhaustion violently threatened to completely dominate her and force her to highly loosen the leather reins. She actively looked straight ahead. There, constantly observing the highly imposing, truly formidable, and completely tireless large figure of Vincent actively cutting through the thick, heavy fog directly in front of her, exactly like a highly indomitable, fierce knight violently protecting his kingdom and his beloved queen. She deeply found brand new, highly unsuspected, and profound strength to fiercely urge her sorrel horse to go increasingly faster and faster toward the deeply sleeping town. When finally, the very first highly pale yellowish lights of the rural town highly timidly appeared on the highly grey, deeply melancholic horizon, the dark sky was merely barely beginning to highly lighten, slowly painting the highly heavy, thick clouds with weak, highly stained shades of purple and highly opaque winter blue. The monumental, highly imposing stone clock erected in the central town square clearly, definitively marked exactly 6:15 in the early morning. They were highly dangerously, terrifyingly on the absolute edge, balancing right on the highly sharp edge of a razor between highly glorious, total victory and absolute total ruin. The busy train station was highly noisily agitated, entirely filled with highly simple, working-class folks in plain clothes, wealthy, highly abasted ranchers in fine hats, and deeply sleepy travelers dragging heavy suitcases, absolutely everyone highly anxiously awaiting the loud whistle that would officially announce the immediate boarding for the capital. Far in the distance, at the absolute highly end of the soot-covered platforms, the thick, hot black smoke of the massive train was already aggressively, heavily rising through the metal chimney straight up into the freezing cold sky, heavily signaling the highly imminent departure. Vincent and Isabel absolutely did not highly slow down in any highly prudent, safe manner upon actively entering the urban zone. Quite the complete opposite, they violently, aggressively invaded the wide cobblestone streets of the town at a highly loose full gallop, the highly chaotic, thunderous noise of the heavy hooves immediately drawing the highly curious, shocked attention of absolutely everyone who was walking on the sidewalks and highly milling about the square. They violently, abruptly braked their highly panting, exhausted horses right exactly in front of the highly ornate main entrance of the train station, kicking up a highly thick, massive cloud of dust and loud indignation directly among the early morning passers-by. Vincent leaped rapidly from the highly dark saddle in an agile, powerful jump of pure, raw energy, absolutely without even highly waiting for the tired animal to completely stop actively moving, and forcefully extended his highly strong arms to quickly help his wife properly dismount. In the exact, highly specific instant that Isabel's boots highly firmly touched the dirty, highly worn pavement of the station, and right before they could even sprint toward the highly crowded internal boarding platforms, the highly despicable, slimy figure they were actively searching for with their highly furious eyes suddenly appeared right in the doorway, completely, utterly paralyzed by the massive fright. It was Lionel Judson, tightly holding a small, highly elegant imported leather traveling suitcase, smiling in a highly victorious, incredibly arrogant and deeply malicious manner at the ticket agent working the entrance. The immense shock of unexpectedly coming completely face to face with Vincent and Isabel right there, heavily covered in road dust, with their highly wrinkled clothes from the night before, and their intense eyes actively burning with a highly unfathomable, completely homicidal fury, violently, instantly ripped the highly mocking smile right off his face so incredibly fast that he took a highly terrified, clumsy step entirely backwards, forcefully dropping the expensive suitcase directly onto the highly waxed floor. absolutely without giving Lionel the slightest, tiniest chance, highly small opportunity, or single fraction of a second to cowardly flee into the highly crowded middle of the people, exactly like the pathetic coward he truly was, or to highly desperately call for the immediate attention of his private hired bodyguards. Vincent aggressively advanced violently upon him. Not with the highly formal protocol coldness or the polite fake diplomacy that was highly customary among the suited landowners of the region, but with the highly visceral, entirely uncontrollable and deeply burning fury of a highly dangerous man who was mortally, absolutely decided to fiercely protect his own heart, his highly beloved woman, and his sacred home. Vincent violently grabbed the completely immaculate collars of Lionel's heavy, expensive Peruvian wool poncho and fine suit jacket with both of his highly calloused, strong hands, forcefully lifting the considerably shorter, smaller man several highly visible inches right off the highly hard stone floor, and shoved him with extreme brutality and highly unnatural, massive strength directly against the highly thick, solid brick wall of the station. The highly dry, incredibly loud and violent thud of the rival's back brutally hitting the solid wall instantly caused several highly terrified travelers entirely around them to loudly scream and rapidly step away in sheer terror, actively creating in a matter of seconds a massive wide circle of highly curious onlookers, extremely eager for a highly massive scandal so early in the day, including the town's highly authoritative sheriff, who was taking his coffee in the bakery directly across the street, and ran highly fast to the scene. With a deep voice that highly thundered with profound violent rage and heavily contained lethal threat, entirely filling the air of the massive lobby with a highly cutting, terrifying timbre that easily frightened even the small pigeons on the roof. Vincent severely, dryly demanded, with his face highly dangerously close to the highly pale, terrified face of the rival, that Lionel highly immediately return. Right, that exact, highly specific second, exactly what he had highly cowardly, violently stolen from inside his highly private safe at the Frontier Ranch, under the highly cowardly dark cover of the night. Lionel, with his small, beady eyes completely bulging out of his head, in highly genuine, pure terror, and his breathing violently choked by the suffocating iron-like grip on his expensive collar, highly pathetically attempted to wildly stutter a highly lying denial of complete innocence, falsely, desperately claiming that he absolutely did not know what the highly crazy, insane rancher was even talking about. But the highly sudden, authoritative presence of the town's armed sheriff, who had actively pushed his way highly forcefully through the highly curious crowd, and was now intently staring at them with a highly interrogative expression, loudly demanding to definitively know the absolute origin of that massive commotion, was the completely perfect, highly precise cue for Isabel to actively step onto the scene and flawlessly execute the highly brilliant second part of the complex plan orchestrated in the dead of night. Before we officially reach the highly emotional, deeply moving climax of this incredibly intense situation, and actively discover exactly how the highly beautiful declaration of love will completely change their future forever. Tell me right here in the comments if you have ever truly lived or actively witnessed a deep love story that initially started in the absolute most improbable, entirely unlikely manner, but actively became incredibly, profoundly strong over time and highly close coexistence. I absolutely love reading these highly inspiring real-life stories of massive perseverance from you. So absolutely do not forget to comment below on your experience or send a beautiful message of support to our highly beloved couple. Isabel took a highly large, entirely confident step entirely forward, her posture highly erect and her facial expression looking profoundly pained, yet completely, absolutely unbreakable. Standing right directly in front of all those highly curious people, the widely known local residents, and the highly attentive authorities of the law, she absolutely did not cower or shrink. With a highly clear, perfectly audible, melodious voice completely laden with a highly dramatic, perfectly calculated, and completely flawless righteous indignation that brilliantly echoed throughout the entire immense, highly dirty vault of the train station, Isabel boldly declared, aggressively pointing her delicate finger straight in the direction of Lionel's highly terrified face, that highly repugnant, disgusting man had not only highly sneakily invaded their highly sacred, highly private property without any invitation in the dead of night, he had absolutely not merely brutally broken into and impetuously destroyed her husband's highly private office and the complete peace of her highly brand new family. What highly, profoundly angered her, exactly what she absolutely could never, ever forgive, she loudly continued, with highly fake tears of perfect acting brilliantly and highly purposefully shining in her burning eyes, was that the highly envious, nasty scoundrel had actively stolen something with absolutely no commercial value, but of highly inestimable, immense, sentimental weight and value for her newly married, deeply in love heart. She firmly, confidently stated with deep, scenic conviction that he had violently taken the highly precious, deeply intimate love letters that her highly beloved Vincent had passionately written to her, actively alongside the highly documented, highly secret promises of eternal marital fidelity that strongly sealed their deep, burning mutual devotion before God himself. The highly absurd, massive audacity of the giant lie and the entirely complete, highly brilliant, public inversion of the highly damning context of that cursed legal document made absolute, real panic immediately, completely stamp itself glaringly all over Lionel's face, completely leaving him entirely without any coherent words. If he were to now, highly proudly, confidently pull the highly cold, strict contract right out of his deep pocket, to publicly, highly embarrassingly call her a liar and actively prove that the marriage was highly, in fact, a massive commercial fraud just to save lands and debts, he would be highly, openly confessing right there, directly in front of the highly armed sheriff of the law present and dozens of entirely shocked, highly attentive witnesses, to the highly terrible, severe crimes of highly premeditated invasion, highly aggravated breaking and entering, and the blatant theft of highly confidential, private documents. Crimes that would highly immediately, violently send him directly into the very bottom of a highly damp, pitch-black prison cell for many, many long years, completely, utterly ruining his highly valuable own life. Isabel had highly, completely cornered him and brutally crushed him, absolutely not with a loaded firearm, but with a highly perfect, flawless verbal trap, entirely constructed utilizing her own highly rapid, bright intelligence and his own highly massive, immediate despair. Lionel highly pathetically attempted to nervously argue, highly babbling, completely disconnected, disjointed sentences directly to the highly confused sheriff and desperately gasping for air from under Vincent's highly strong, choking hands, frantically saying that the crazy wife's wild accusations were completely pure, total fabrications of a highly hysterical woman, and that he absolutely had not invaded any highly ranch to actively steal ridiculous, highly romantic declarations or highly worthless papers from a broken safe. Vincent, immediately perceiving the highly sweeping, entirely brilliant genius and the highly incontestable total triumph of his wife's masterful strategy, highly immediately released Lionel's heavily wrinkled collar and stepped back exactly one very small, highly calculated step, highly generously offering ample space for the complete, highly public humiliation of the bitter rival. He, the highly strict man who had forcefully started the entire arrangement, heavily demanding sepulchral coldness for 6 highly uninterrupted months, completely, entirely surrendered himself to the highly public moment of deep exposure. with a highly wide, incredibly affectionate, highly liberating smile, completely unseen publicly by any highly single soul in that entire town, in all of his highly reclusive dark life. He openly declared, in a highly loud and crystal-clear sound, highly looking out of the corner of his eye at the eager onlookers and directly at the highly attentive sheriff, that he deeply, profoundly regretted having highly physically assaulted Mr. Judson in that violent manner. But he highly passionately and entirely convincingly explained directly to the highly eager gossiping crowd that the highly sacred honor, the highly dearest, deepest secrets, and the highly profound words of unconditional, highly burning love, actively dedicated exclusively to his highly beloved, entirely untouchable wife, were absolutely his highly most precious, extremely well-guarded treasures, highly invaluable assets that he would actively, fiercely defend with his very own highly life, violently punching the highly iron gates of hell itself if he absolutely had to. Vincent turned highly slowly and confidently walked with highly short, steady steps directly over to Isabel, right there, right directly in the highly middle of the dusty station and the scattered luggage, entirely and completely oblivious to the highly amazed, loud murmuring of the highly curious crowd and the highly emotional, excited gossip of the highly rural ladies. Right there in front of the highly entire town that had once highly strictly judged him to be a completely highly gelid, terrifyingly tyrannical, and entirely soulless, emotionless being, he pulled her highly delicately, yet incredibly firmly by the small waist straight into his highly broad, strong arms, highly affectionately caressed the highly disheveled strands of her dark hair, completely messed up by the highly freezing wind, and violently stole from her right there. Entirely in highly open public, an incredibly ardent, highly long, and profoundly, deeply real kiss. There were absolutely no more highly scenic performances actively demanded by highly strict, rigid contractual clauses. There absolutely no longer existed any highly fake, protocol-driven farce. That highly public stolen kiss directly in the highly dusty lobby of the old train station permanently and entirely sealed the highly true, deeply lasting and entirely undeniable contract between their highly once solitary bruised souls. The completely humiliated, highly defeated and entirely demoralized Lionel actively seeing himself entirely, utterly destroyed by that highly incontestable, public scene of massive romantic devotion that completely and entirely prevented him from highly proudly exhibiting the violently stolen document without actively highly confessing to his own highly heinous, highly severe crime before the highly strict law, highly sneakily grabbed his small, expensive suitcase, violently thrown on the floor, while the highly entire circle of people actively paid full attention solely to the highly kissing couple. He highly opportunistically took advantage of the highly massive distraction of the local police, completely enchanted by the highly novelistic, beautiful romance. Deeply sank his chin into his heavily wrinkled, expensive suit jacket, and completely slinked away, highly unnoticed, directly into the highly grey, dark shadows of the boarding platform, far too highly embarrassed to even highly proffer a single, highly venomous word. Highly cowardly, boarding the very first available train car exactly like the highly pathetic, fleeing coward he absolutely had always, entirely been, and actively leaving the highly disputed lands completely behind him forever. 5 highly prosperous, incredibly luminous and highly happy years completely flew by over the highly fertile, rich lands of the Montana plains, entirely following that highly confusing, deeply dangerous, and completely liberating cold morning directly at the town station. The old, Highly dark pages of Vincent's highly controlling grandfather's old will, and the highly suffocating, deeply cursed deadlines of the highly greedy capital banks became absolutely nothing more than highly distant, completely unimportant ghosts of old memories for the highly loving couple, merely highly dusty pages, long highly forgotten or completely, appropriately burned right in the hot campfires. The massive, highly profound leap in time completely, entirely healed the old wounds. The highly grand, incredibly silent, and deeply intimidating frontier ranch, which Isabel had one day highly terrifiedly judged in the dark past to be a highly true, massive prison entirely of cold marble and thick ice, actively inhabited by a highly heartless, cruel jailer, now highly openly overflowed with highly warm, yellowish lights. Highly comforting smells of freshly baked homemade cakes on the porches, the highly spontaneous, highly loud laughter, and the highly constant, joyful dialogues of the frequent gatherings of neighbors highly during the late, warm afternoons. On a highly mild, incredibly soft and entirely sunny spring afternoon in the year 1929, highly directly under a deeply spectacular, completely clear blue sky, entirely free of any highly dense grey clouds, Isabel was highly carefree, walking completely at peace straight through the highly ample, incredibly colourful and perfectly blooming gardens that now highly beautifully surrounded the entire vast property, gently holding the leather reins of a highly newborn, incredibly tame, beautiful foal. She smiled warmly to herself upon highly remembering the highly improbable, incredibly chaotic beginning of her marriage. But her highly happy, joyful thoughts were completely interrupted by the highly familiar, loud whinny of a strong horse and by the highly soft, rhythmic trot of heavy footsteps rapidly approaching on the smooth stones of the highly large main courtyard of the house. Vincent quickly and highly agilely dismounted from his highly imposing, massive, dark stallion and walked directly toward her with that exact, highly same, incredibly magnetic and fiercely protective dark gaze that always, highly, entirely disarmed her completely since the highly terrifying night of the storm. That exactly same, highly intense, dark brown shine that, completely unlike the highly foolish demands and the highly ridiculous, strict deadlines of highly signed. Old contracts of a deeply torn, old paper from half a highly decade ago absolutely did not have any highly expiration date whatsoever to expire or grow highly cold in the highly many course of the wonderful years to come. Vincent smiled highly openly, a completely sincere, highly tranquil, beautiful smile that entirely illuminated his entire handsome face and heavily exposed the highly distinguished lines of maturity that the highly hard battles had deeply given him, and highly provocatively asked, in a highly calm, romantic flirtation, slowly wrapping the leather reins around the highly low wooden fence, if his beautiful wife clearly remembered that there was a highly cold time in the past when they barely even highly spoke to each other during the highly isolated meals. Isabel laughed highly softly, gently letting go of the highly tame foal and highly slowly walking over directly to her highly handsome husband to gently adjust the highly crisp collar of his shirt, highly warmly answering in a highly sweet, highly playful tone that highly grey, cold period was exactly right after she had highly completely saved his skin entirely in front of the highly entire town at the train station and completely guaranteed the highly massive success of the vast ranch for the entire highly rest of their long lives. Vincent highly gently wrapped his highly strong arm around her highly small waist in a highly protective, warm manner, highly agreeing completely with a highly slight, deeply passionate nod of his head, gently deposited a highly affectionate, warm kiss directly on the forehead of the highly incredible woman who was the highly absolute, complete owner of absolutely everything he highly had. and definitively highly proved that the absolute highly coldest, incredibly hardest, and highly most calculated decisions of the strict intellect often are, in the highly final end of the day, the highly mysterious, highly beautiful way that highly unpredictable destiny finds to actively guide us directly toward the absolute, highly most ardent, deeply true, and highly unbreakable beautiful story of massive overcoming and passionate love that highly exists.